So I think that most of you have made their way now from the waiting room into the main room. So I think that we can switch over from showing you our introductory slide to having everybody on screen. So, welcome everybody to our inauguration event. Today is an exciting day, and all of us on this side of the Atlantic, I think, are a little bit jealous of not being on the other side of the Atlantic to see and feel and hear what is going on. But we decided to do this event today so that also our American participants can share a little bit of the impressions you have and what's going on in Washington, D.C. This is unfortunately one of our last, if not the last, event we are doing under our Road to Election series. Not quite the last, but one of the last ones. And we were so happy to have so many partners traveling this way together towards the elections and afterwards. I'm really happy that we did all together around 37 events with more than 3,500 participants, and there were 35 partners in this endeavor. And I want to thank all of them for traveling this way with us. We had a wonderful array of events, and I hope that we are going to continue this in the future. This particular event in which we have dialed in today is co-organized by us, the Aspen Institute Germany, but also the American German Institute, Amerika Zentrum Hamburg, and the America House Nordrhein-Westfalen. And it is really wonderful to see all of you here and to have such strong partners on board for this event. I will be your tour guide, but you will have a lot of opportunity to meet and exchange ideas with all the other partners of today's event and also of the election night. We also have a wonderful number of speakers lined up, and you have seen them, and we are also going to post their CVs into our chat function so that they're such renowned experts, so they deserve a little bit more space, which I can't give them in my introduction because you also want to get to the discussion. So first, I would like to introduce Peter Rashish to you. Hello, Peter. So nice that you're joining us, and there you are waving. So everybody has spotted you. As Vice President and Director of the Geoeconomics program at the American German Institute, and Peter publishes regularly on transatlantic economic issues, on trade issues, and I'm very honored that you are, Peter, also a regular guest at our events, and I'm always thrilled if we can cooperate with each other. So thank you, Peter, for joining us today. Joshua Meltzer, thank you so much, Joshua, for joining us today, is a senior fellow at Brookings, leading the Digital Economy and Trade Project. And I'm pretty sure with everything happening currently in the digital space, you must have your hands full as well. You are also a co-lead for the Forum on AI cooperation and the USMCA initiative. So I'm really happy that you are joining us today. I'm also delighted to introduce Rachel Rizzo to you. And if you're not following her on social media, you should definitely do so. I do, and I can only report that Rachel, your analysis is always so spot on. She is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and her research focuses on European security, on NATO, and the Transatlantic Partnership. I'm also delighted to introduce Ian Brzezinski to you. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. He is a senior fellow with the Snowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and also a member of the Atlantic Council's Strategic Advisory Group. And I'm pretty sure that you will help us to understand all matters of security. And I'm also happy that now I'm seeing all of you again on my screen. We were in the background working out how we can put a focus on our speakers. It's also a great pleasure to introduce Laura Thornton to you. Hello, Laura. She is Senior Director for Global Democracy Programs at the McCain Institute. You have worked a lot on democracy issues, on transatlantic relations, and we are really delighted that you are able to join us today. Maria Skóra is a policy fellow at das Progressive Zentrum. And Maria, thank you so much for joining us as well. You will bring in also a lot of the expertise you have on international transatlantic relations, on economic issues, but also social issues. And I'm very sure that you will also bring in the progressive view into our discussion. Maria, thank you so much for joining us. So these are our wonderful speakers. And before we get into more in-depth policy discussions in the breakout sessions, I want to give our speakers, every one of them, the opportunity to share with us two things. The first one, I just want to hear very briefly from our American participants how the mood is currently in Washington, D.C., or in other cities of the United States. How does it feel, Peter, being in Washington, not so far away from the White House, from the Capitol? What's going on?
Well, I have to concede that I've been doing some foreign intelligence work, and I'm actually on your side of the
Oh!
so I can't report on my hometown as of today, but I would say that I can report on people I've talked to in Europe, and the level of let's just be neutral and say interest is about as high as I've ever seen it in terms of what's going on in Washington.
Thank you so much. If you're on this side of the Atlantic, I hope you're going to stop by and say hello.
My best.
So if I may ask, Rachel, you are on the US side right now. So how does it feel?
You know, it's interesting. I've been back in Salt Lake City, Utah for the last week or so, and I flew back to Washington on Saturday night. And the last leg of my flight from Chicago to Washington was just packed with folks that were flying in from all parts of the United States to attend Donald Trump's inauguration, that, of course, as we all know, has been moved inside now. But you really feel, I've been in DC for a few inaugurations now, and you really feel a shift in the vibe of the city, if that's the way you want to put it. It definitely feels like there's this really strong confluence of these powerful tech moguls with Trump and policymakers. I was at an event last night that was co-hosted by the Free Press and X, and you had people like Eric Zemmour there. You had people like Liz Truss there, Conor McGregor, the famous boxer. So it was just this really sort of bizarre mix of personalities that are now in this very influential fold, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your views and giving us an impression. Ian, what would you say? How does it feel on your side of the Atlantic?
Well, I'm in Washington, and there's definitely a real feeling of kind of triumphalism on part of the Republican Party, and particularly its MAGA dimension. They're coming back to town, feeling vindicated. They're more emboldened, and maybe a deep sense of resentment towards, quote unquote, the establishment. I think among the left. You got to remember, this is an election where it was nearly a 50-50 outcome, with Trump getting a margin of advantage in the popular vote, but unease on part of the Democrats. But that's really the Washington establishment. My sense that nationally is while there was shock at the last Trump win in 2016, even among the Trumpites themselves, they were like not even sure they had won when they came to office. But this time, I think American public is a little bit more inured to this outcome. It's considered unusual. It's a big win. It's a return of Trump, but it's more business than usual than shock and awe, I would say, nationally.
Thank you so much, Ian. And Joshua, maybe we can also hear from you, your impressions.
Yeah, no, I think that's right what Ian was saying. I was, a number of people that I think reflected on sort of the response and sense of absolute shock in 2016. And I think while there's certainly on the left and the Democratic side a lot of disappointment and concern, it's not that level of kind of shock that we had then. And I'm not sure if people are sort of resigned to sort of another 4 years, or they're sort of just holding back to wait to see what happens. But the level of kind of emotion is different, I think, from 2016 certainly. So we'll see. I mean, I think the triumphalism is definitely in the air, and but I think also people are gearing up for probably a very turbulent couple of years, and then hoping that sort of the Democrats will gain one or two houses of Congress, and then we can sort of focus on the damage that probably happens on the foreign policy side.
Thank you so much. And Laura, do you also want to come in?
I think it really, the mood, it obviously depends on who you talk to. So my uncle in northern Michigan is, delighted and doing cartwheels. But the mood among my people, the democracy hacks in Washington, is extremely.
Laura, it might be just me, but the sound is not perfect. Maybe you could come a little bit closer to the mic.
No? Okay. I will try to relog in, I guess.
Okay. Okay. It was perfect before when we did the tests, but that is what our Zoom world is about. So Laura, yeah, if you could try to just hop off and then on again, that would be wonderful. But I also want to bring in Maria. Maybe you can also tell us how you view the mood on this inauguration day.
Well, I'm not based in DC right now, where I was just maybe 2 months ago. Right now, I'm actually in Europe. And I think in Europe, we are looking to Washington, DC today, and we feel this burden or this task to step up as European nations. I'm actually a dual citizen, German-Polish dual citizen. And it's also interesting to see how tables can turn. And how the role of European capitals is raising. So we're, I guess, speaking for all of us, I think we are looking with both excitement and anxiety at Washington, D.C., what is coming to us, how this cooperation in the coming 4 years will play out.
Yeah, I think we are all very excited about this to know how this is going to play out. And Laura, let's try again.
Can you hear me now?
So much better. Perfect.
All right. Don't know what that was. Sorry, I missed Maria's beginning. But I was just going to say the mood obviously depends on who you talk to. I was saying that my uncle in northern Michigan is doing cartwheels, but my people here in Washington, D.C., and by my people, I mean the democracy community, I would say I'd slightly disagree with others. I would say it's a lot more stressed than 2016. People in my community are very concerned about not only democracy in the United States, but support for global democracy and our commitment to this community of values and the broader threat that Autocrats Incorporated pose for us. So and then I spent my Friday afternoon at the Ukrainian embassy. And I'll tell you, the fear there and stress and anxiety is palpable. So it's really a mixed bag. I mean, you have a lot of excitement of Trump supporters here in Washington, although they're not allowed inside the rotunda. They still are very happy to be here and thrilled and feel that they have a mandate in a landslide, even though it was not a landslide. And then you have people that are concerned about their very existence as a nation, like Ukraine, or the state of our democratic institutions. So it's a mixed bag.
Thank you so much. And we'll have more opportunity to go into detail. But I now wanted to ask all of you, because then we can build on this in our breakout sessions, is in your specific policy field, what do you think are the three main main challenges we are going to deal with in the transatlantic relationship. Laura, since your mic is working so wonderful, maybe I can start with you and do it the other way around this time.
Well, I know there's experts here on economy, trade, security, which of course are huge challenges going forward, but I'll stick to my three, which I've alluded to already. One, protecting Ukraine. I am very concerned about ensuring a just peace for Ukraine, an agreement with security guarantees for Ukraine, not a deal that hands over power or even a ceasefire, which just gives Putin time to regroup. My second big challenge is related to preserving alliances and bolstering cooperation externally against autocrats and their encroachment, both kinetic, related to Ukraine, and non-kinetic, related to I lived 25 years overseas. So I lived in Tbilisi in my last post for 7 years. And that's what I'm very concerned about, is our ability as a transatlantic community to prevent those countries that are quickly falling into Putin and autocrats' orbit. And then my third challenge is, so in addition to the external looking collaboration for democracies to stick together, my third challenge is related to our ability to fend off transatlantic illiberalism and our commitment to rising democratic backsliding, to combating rising democratic backsliding in all of our countries. This is shared across the Atlantic, and addressing what I see as a very strong and increasing demand side among our publics for illiberal strongmen. And this is going to require us sharing best practice the way autocrats do. It's going to require us to tackle information disorder. It's going to require us to deal with autocratic interference.
Thank you very much for also raising important issues for our transatlantic values partnership. And big question if we still have the same values, the same hierarchy of values, and how to deal with this. Thank you so much, Laura. Joshua, in your policy field or in your field of analysis, what do you think are the biggest challenges for transatlantic relations?
Yeah, well, focusing, I guess, on the trade piece, the obvious one is tariffs, which Trump has threatened Europe and other countries with 10 to 20% across the board, and he seems keen to fulfill that. So, you know, much broader based tariffs, I think, on Europe than we've seen in the past, and then I think the second and third order effects in terms of how Europe responds, whether there is an opportunity to diffuse that or whether there's retaliation and sort of a cycle of further trade retaliation and more tariffs, I think will be, you know, critical to how the ultimate economic impact plays out. I think, you know, the other related to that, I think, is going to be in the technology space. It's unclear, I think, what the Trump administration's technology policy will look like at this stage. A number of key people from the first Trump administration, Kratsios is going back into OSTP, Lillian Parker's going back into the administration as well on the science and technology side, where, you know, signature leaders of a lot of the executive orders on AI, for instance, that were quite sensible. That came out during the first term, so that may signal some continuity there. But then, of course, you've got much more influence from the tech sector, Elon Musk and others. And so how that evolves and the role of David Sachs is unclear. But clearly there's already a focus on the Digital Markets Act and the impact on US companies, and, you know, just general concern about what is seen as overregulation in Europe. And so whether that sort of really bubbles up and becomes a core focus in the transatlantic, I think is a real risk, and and risk creating further, I think, tensions between the US and the EU. And then, you know, I think the final piece I'd say, which is, you know, both a risk and an opportunity, probably is sort of where China plays into the transatlantic relationship. I think it will clearly be an ongoing focus for the Trump administration, and you know, it's obviously a very significant trading relationship for Europe, and the extent that there's differences or important differences, I think, where the US ends up under Trump on China and where Europe ends up, I think, is also a risk, but also potentially an opportunity for cooperation. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
And I'll jump in because I think so. Stormy is unfortunately struggling a bit with the flu, and we made a deal that I would jump in if she was having a coughing fit. So thank you so much for that. I think I would love to hand it over to Peter just to see. I know you're speaking on the trade topic today. Do you feel the same? Or those your also top 3 points?
I mean, there's some overlap, but actually, I think I've succeeded in framing them in three different ways. So the first for me is global economic disorder. I think Trump has been a symptom and a cause of the decline in global economic order. I think, though, that China's industrial overcapacity and tech advances have been another big one of reason for that. And the WTO hasn't been able to keep up with either Trump or China. He's going to certainly exacerbate global economic disorder in his second term. He doesn't believe in the concept of economic order. And so I think that's going to be a serious challenge. The second challenge I would see is looking at the EU is distraction, because I think Trump's tariffs, which Joshua mentioned, are going to be a big distraction for the EU. They're going to have to devote a lot of resources to figuring out how to react to them or not, at a time when they have to really double down on reform, picking up from the Letta and the Draghi reports, and build not just broadly EU competitiveness, but really tough individual pieces of that, like a capital markets union, a defense union, tech and infrastructure investment. So Europe needs to do that at a time when they're going to be distracted by the U.S. And the third one, I would say, looking a little optimistically still, is cooperation. Despite all these other two things I mentioned, is there a way for the U.S. and the EU to find some kind of basis to work together? And I think the question is whether Trump's transactional approach can, at least in particular areas, also be in service of transatlantic interests. And we'll find out.
Thank you. And I think what's interesting too is already we've heard a lot of the points mentioned relate to security with China, with Ukraine. So I'm curious to hear what you, Ian and Rachel, also kind of are your major concerns. Do you share the same? Is it all kind of interlinked? Maybe I can ask you, Rachel, to give your thoughts.
Sure, happy to start. So in terms of the security aspect of Trump's presidency, I think it's hard to predict what his long-term approach to Europe is going to be, although it's really easy to reference his first term in terms of how he views both the European Union and NATO. At the very least, I do think that economics will largely determine the overall health of the relationship. I think that's going to be the heartbeat of it. But to the extent that he focuses on security as sort of an extension of that main issue set, I think the NATO 2% measurement is out the window, and he'll push allies to keep spending more and more and hone in on those that don't. Although I do think Italy and Giorgia Meloni are going to be an exception to this rule, just because I think they're naturally aligned on how they see the world. In terms of like the three big challenges, first, I think both Europe and the United States sort of rested on their laurels a little bit over the past 4 years, assuming that this underlying contract between the US and Europe will remain the same in the long term, which is that we are a community of shared norms and values, with the US committed to Europe's long-term security. And I think that those norms and values are still there, but I don't think that's going to be what drives the relationship forward. And I don't think that has set up either side to successfully approach the relationship through this transactionalist lens that Trump and his team likely will. And I think that Europe could be surprised. Number two, Europe could be surprised by what Trump's focus on the Indo-Pacific means for U.S. security commitments in Europe. His administration is going to be staffed by so-called prioritizers, those who believe that the European over-reliance on the U.S. for its security guarantees is a suck on U.S. resources and comes at the expense of our ability to project power elsewhere in the world. And I worry that if there's some quick decision about how or if to redeploy U.S. forces, and I'm not saying that there will be, but I worry that if that happened, that this is going to leave Europe dangerously exposed. And then finally on Ukraine, I think if there is a ceasefire or some sort of negotiated settlement, which I think that there likely will be, Trump will expect Europe to be the one that holds the line on this. And I think the only way that the United States will provide critical enablers needed to enforce a ceasefire is if the Europeans commit to boots on the ground. And I think that's politically going to be pretty difficult. I don't think NATO is going to be on the table over the next 4 years. I think that's as much of a red line for Trump as it is for Putin, which means I think the Europeans are going to need to be ready to provide a NATO-like long-term security guarantee. So I think Ukraine is definitely going to be a tough one as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Ian, do you agree?
Hey, thanks, Katja. Yeah, I'm in fundamental agreement with my colleagues. You know, when I think of kind of the three big challenges before the transatlantic relationship over the next 4 or more years, it's similar to what's been said. First and foremost, it's going to be the challenge of defeating Russia's invasion and establishing some sort of military stability on NATO's eastern frontier. And we kind of know where Trump's coming in. But I got to say, this is a time for Europe to step up and pull Trump in the right direction of what needs to be done. And this is going to require leadership from Europe that has not been the norm. And Rachel kind of indicated correctly. One will be, you know, the willingness of the Europeans to step up now with some sort of deterrent force to be postured into Europe. That's the only way you're going to get the right response out of Trump. This issue, you know, how we handle together Ukraine is going to be the issue that defines the future of the transatlantic relationship. Second, it's establishing some sort of transatlantic response, a cohesive, comprehensive transatlantic strategy to the challenge posed by Chinese aggression. Failure to do so, failure for the Europeans to stand closely with the United States in managing this could be just as decoupling as the defeat in Ukraine. And third, kind of broadly speaking, when I look at the future of the transatlantic relationship, one of the things that worries me most is our inability, our joint inability to really manage, reduce, and counter the pernicious and polarizing dynamics caused by the flow of disinformation. This is undermining transatlantic unity and efficacy. And if we don't get a grip on it, it's going to be decoupling, it's going to be divisive, and it's going to be destabilizing in ways we can't even imagine.
Yeah, also a really important point that I think also impacts the other security areas. I'm sensing a theme that there's a lot of commonality between them. Maria, maybe I can hand it to you. I think we'll come full circle back to our to Laura's points, and we've already seen how kind of cross-pollinated they all are.
Absolutely. So my field of research in the last years has been democratization, autocratization, democratic resilience, and I could only echo some of the points made by my colleagues. And I'll start with the first challenge, which is democracy versus the illiberal international. That has already been mentioned, that the victory of Donald Trump, especially looking at the campaign, what it was is a boost to other illiberal leaders. And we know that Alice Weidel in Germany has already called Trump a role model. There is a very solid connection with Viktor Orban. So on the supply side, we need democratic leaders to work together. This is to echo what Ian just said. And on the demand side, well, we have to work for the resilience of our citizens against disinformation, more education, civic education, and understanding political processes so that they don't fall into the trap of malign influence and populism in general, regardless on which side of the Atlantic. That brings me to the other challenge, which might be the rule of law in the United States. We've already seen the last time that when Donald Trump was in power that the quality of democracy in the United States has diminished. And the rule of law is a guarantee of a stability and reliable partnership in trade, security, under forms of diplomatic cooperation in bilateral and multilateral relations. So I guess here at the European end of this transatlantic connection, we'll have to be aware of and observe very carefully how checks and balances and political will versus institutions are working in the United States in the coming months and years. And last but not least, and it's a more practical challenge, is communication style and rhetoric. Last time when Donald Trump was in office, he called Europe a foe, and an enemy. Now we've just had this Greenland debate. And I think we should not get provoked and focus on the important things, learn to distinguish between rants and communication for his own supporters from actual messaging and goals, and focus on what's important. So I think this could be a challenge, not to get into meaningless and only escalating rants, and remain cool-headed in the important debates on sometimes diverging interests of European partners and American partners. That's it at my end.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's such an important point, and also just thinking about how other actors will react differently this time when we think about the media, when we think about obviously European partners. That's also a big part of the conversation today, which we definitely want to get into a little more deeply at this point. I think that was a helpful scene setter, and we want to dive even more intensively into the topics today. We know that there's a zillion kind of topical policy areas we could tackle. We selected to focus on trade, on security, and on the transatlantic value partnership today. And what we will do, just for our audience, so that you and our, those who are going to be in conversation with us can better understand how we're going to do this. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly to make sure everybody knows how to join the breakout groups. So one moment. So you should all see this screen, and we came up with some handy dandy tutorial photos for you. So at the bottom of your screen in just a moment, everyone will see this option that's called breakout sessions. It's a little bit small, but hopefully you can see there are, you see participants and chat. This is in German, but there's one that'll say breakout groups or breakout sessions. If everyone clicks on that, they'll then have the option to join one of the two external ones. So there's security and transatlantic community of values. So depending on what topic has maybe interested you most from these initial thoughts, or is more in your professional wheelhouse, whatever interests you the most today, you'll just click on the little blue button next to that, join or beitreten, and it will send you right into that breakout group. Those who would like to talk about trade and stay in that breakout session will just remain in this room. So everyone who wants to join trade, you don't have to do anything. Those who would like to join security will join the breakout group labeled security. And then those who want to join transatlantic community of values will join that. I hope that is clear for anyone. We also have several of our staff people on the call. So if anybody has any tech issues, please feel free to write into the chat, and we can assign you also manually in case anybody has any issues with the tech piece. Okay, I feel like our speakers are ready to dive into a little bit more deeply. So I would recommend that everyone just go ahead and join the breakout sessions at the bottom. And we will go ahead and get started in those small groups. Thanks so much.
If you can help me as well, that'd be
Yes,
great.
I am on it.
I can't see Maria right now.
I'm here. I'm in the call.
Yeah, I saw you. I just can't
Okay.
pin you at the moment.
All right, maybe I can pin myself.
All right, we'll work on that. I count on your help, and we'll get started. My name is Victoria Harbecke. I'm the director of the America House, NRW, one of the co-hosts of this event, and it's my pleasure to moderate this breakout session. I hope you can all hear me well. If not, please do let me know. Thanks, Laura. Appreciate that. We'll keep it among us three for about 10 minutes or so, and then we do want to open it up. This is meant to be interactive. Since we have a bit of a bigger group, I would kindly ask you to either type your questions in the chat or to raise your hand, ideally via the raise hand function here in Zoom, and then I'll call on you, or read the questions from the chat so that we have a little bit of order in what is meant to be an interactive conversation. Thank you so much, Laura and Maria, for your input. To get us started, I actually would like to pick up something that Rachel Rizzo said just now in the joint session to get your take on. She said, the community of values, which is the focus of our discussion now, it's still there, but it's not going to drive the transatlantic relationship in the next 4 years. Is that an assessment that you share? Maybe we start with you, Laura, and then Maria.
Sure. Well, I think it's really complicated to talk about transatlantic relations as if it's between countries, and particularly when it comes to values, because what we're seeing it's much messier. It's not about countries as much as it is about movements or people. So there are all these cross-cutting alliances. So, for example, you have really strong connections between far-right illiberal movements in countries on both sides of the Atlantic. Whether it's through CPAC or Viktor Orban's, he had recently a political community international conference. And so those folks are united by values, right? And then there are those of us who are more in support of liberal democratic values that also exist on both sides of the Atlantic, regardless of who is in power. And that is what we would call a community of democracies. We saw when Joe Biden came in, he launched, I've been very critical of it for many respects, but the underlying aim of the Democracy Summit was to bring together Democrats, lowercase d, on both sides of the Atlantic, and ensure that we can counter what the far-right movements are doing. I don't think we've been as effective at sharing best practices and tactics. So I think with regard to at the government level, with Trump in office, I agree, I think where Rachel was going, which is priority for the Trump administration is not about these things. It is not about democracy. It is not about human rights. If anything, his people have pledged to completely defang USAID, cut funding for democracy and human rights work. His priorities are transactional. His priorities are domestic. His priority is, tackling immigration, tax cuts, deregulation, retribution. These are his domestic priorities. Internationally, it's about getting a good deal, not being ripped off. I'm quoting, I'm not agreeing, and implementing tariffs and isolationism. So we have to look at this in a little bit of more of a complex way, because there's sort of what governments are doing, and then there what movements and people are doing. So I do think we can be united transatlantically around values that might not be held by, our leadership. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. But I do agree with the premise that this is going to change in the new administration.
Understood. Thank you. Maria, how about you?
Well, I think what Laura said is very important, namely that the liberal democracies that we have in Europe are not even recognized as the ideal form of regime by some of the European leaders. And in that sense, we have to ask the question, what are actually the values that we practically follow, that our governments follow. I was mentioning in my intro that and Laura's, this was also Laura's points, that we are facing the rise of the new international illiberal, which is also a platform of cooperation. And so the transatlantic bond was always founded, at least, especially during the Cold War, on the values of liberal democracy. And after 1989, we can see that the nature of the transatlantic bond is also changing. So perhaps, and I don't want to say I don't want to be the devil's advocate and say maybe we should change the values we're following. But this came up also very loud and clear and very pronounced in our introductory words that the democratic leaders both in Europe and those in the United States. I mean, Donald Trump is not an absolute ruler, right? We have a political elite, we have the Democratic Party, we have Republicans who are still committed to democratic values. So I would say that more generally, people who believe in democratic values should be maybe more active to overcome and somehow survive the upcoming turbulent times. And Donald Trump is not the only one, the only illiberal leader, right? A very powerful one, but also inside the EU, in Europe, we are facing the rise of populist, illiberal, even extremist parties. So not to point fingers, but we should also not feel too complacent about that. And of course, today is a very special day, but the challenges we are facing in the US are perhaps like, in a laboratory or like a very essence of challenges that we might be facing in other countries. So long story short, those who are in favor of the transatlantic relationship based on the values of democracy, of human rights, on the rule of law that I also already mentioned, should step up and should be ready to defend those values and build around those values in the coming years, and not only because of Donald Trump.
Thank you. I will definitely want to circle back to that, but I would like to dig a little bit deeper into sort of what's putting so much pressure on democracy on both sides of the Atlantic, as you rightly pointed out. How do you see the situation? Maybe you could elaborate on that in the US now on this day and going forward, Laura, and then you, Maria, for Europe. Which are the most important pressure points considering both external challenges and internal stressors?
Sure. I actually, I used to work at mostly I was in the field 25 years with NDI, the National Democratic Institute. And then I went to International IDEA, where we measured 183 countries and their democratic health in a global state of democracy. And I think we have more in common than apart in terms of what's driving democratic backsliding. I think a lot of focus has been on institutions failing to deliver and, corruption and elites taking over the democratic system, which pushes people away. And all of this is really true. But I think there's been a lot of focus on that supply side, like how institutions have failed people, how political finance and or corruption has led people to be disenchanted with democracy. And a lot of issues related to economic and the global economy, et cetera. And I think these are all important. But I think what's maybe less discussed are on the demand side and the deep social values cleavages in our society. And not to give people homework, but if you're interested in really interesting study on this, Pippa Norris at Harvard has actually done studies where she's controlled for all those other things like economic decline or inflation or all these other things. And actually it doesn't have as much effect as these deep traditional cultural values cleavages. So in other words, issues related to gender, issues related to LGBTQ, issues related to traditional pecking orders and hierarchies of power and privilege being disrupted and people revolting against that. And that is fed by a lot of things that came up in the first session related to our information space, related to our increasingly living in different silos geographically and economically. So back to the United States, I mean, sure, we can talk about how people feel left out of the economy in the United States and are revolting against that, or they distrust institutions, or they're upset about the price of eggs. But a lot of the driving factors, and we could see this in Trump's campaign because they figured it out quite quickly. Their closing message is, Harris is for they, them, I'm for you. That is completely a culturally driven message and wokeism. And this is what has driven a lot of it. And it's not very dissimilar from what, I lived in Georgia for a long time. I've worked in Moldova. These are the same trigger points that are also manipulated, and you asked about foreign, in terms of foreign information operations. This is like the number one, and I've worked tracking foreign disinformation. That's one of the number one themes is zoning in on these values divisions within our societies. So I think that this is, of course, there are many reasons democracies backslide, and there's many reasons we're seeing this trend, but I think we can't neglect that we have a people problem. We're electing our strongmen. They're not really coming through coups of our grandparents and parents' generation. We're choosing them at the ballot box. So I think this is where we need to focus a lot of our attention, in addition to focusing on making sure our institutions are working right and benefiting our publics.
Thank you. Maria?
So I spent almost half a year last year in the United States researching democratic resilience and a comparative perspective between Germany and the US. And I think maybe a few thoughts that came out of that analysis would be useful for this discussion, because it might seem a very exotic idea to compare such different systems as Germany and the United States are. And of course, institutionally, they vary a lot. And Germany also, for a fact, has not been tested. German institutions have not been tested with a German Trump, right? So we actually don't know how the institutional resilience would behave had we had a sort of wannabe autocrat in power. But I would like to echo what Laura said about those soft dimensions of democratic resilience. And what I was looking at in my research was, for example, the level of disinformation and media bubbles that citizens or consumers are consuming, and how especially voters of liberal populist parties like the MAGA wing of the Republican Party or the AfD, how they are in a way separated in the sense of where the source of their information is, how they rely on the internet, how they rely on non-mainstream media, non-establishment media, which per se is not necessarily a bad thing to have a diverse access to information, but they're very, that makes them susceptible to disinformation and manipulation. And you can see media bubbles when it comes to consuming news, especially in the United States. You have also very Republican private broadcasters and very liberal private broadcasters. And this also contributes to gaps growing between two camps. And that brings me to the polarization that we see not only in the US, but also in Europe. I'm currently in Warsaw, and I can tell you that the division between the supporters of the current government and former government could not be bigger. This is a multi-party system in theory, but a bipartisan system in reality. And this is another thing that is a threat to our democracy, where there is no common ground or in absolutely any topic between the supporters of different political camps, because everything boils down to partisanship. And Pew Research, Pew Center, the research of the Pew Research Center was clearly indicated that Democrats and Republicans cannot find this common denominator. Maybe foreign policy, but especially worldview issues could not be different. And I'm afraid this is where we are drifting away in some, if not many, European societies. And last but not least, political accountability. People are more and more often disappointed with the performance of their governments. They feel that their needs are not met in turbulent times. We had inflation, we had COVID, we have war raging, and the EU closest neighborhood, actually 2 wars. Fortunately, there is a ceasefire finally in the Middle East. But this all contributes to economic problems, but also a feeling of insecurity, and some segments of society feeling that their needs are not met. And that is a perfect storm for choosing politicians and political actors that offer radical ideas, irresponsible ideas, easy ideas to complex problems. And that's one side of political accountability. But another one is that some political parties allow such candidates to at all run. in the elections. And we saw it with Donald Trump, who was not impeached, who had this long list of different collisions with the law, and nevertheless became a Republican presidential candidate for the third time. And in Germany, I can again refer to the AfD and some of their politicians who make statements which are very which are historical revisionism, for example, and they never seem to meet any consequences for it. So, long story short, if we're talking about the challenges to democracy, although we function in different systems, and although they're perhaps not that vibrant and powerful politicians in power in Europe that there is in the US, we actually are facing many similar challenges. And again, in Europe, we should not feel too complacent, because as the case of Hungary or Poland or now Austria shows, or Italy, it's a matter sometimes of one elections for tables to turn, and perhaps turn not in the good direction.
Thank you for laying out that whole field of challenges. We have a first, let's say, question/comment in the chat, which I would like to read to you. And this is also the time where I would like to encourage everyone else to raise your hands or type your questions in the chat so that we can open it up. Rachel Gold, thank you for posting here. I'd like to unpack that idea of surviving the turbulent times ahead and question if that's too passive of an approach. Rather, we must engage and be more active, those of us in favor of a community of democracies, to counter and weaken these rising forces like the Trump administration and other more blatant autocracies. Ideally, when the next round of elections comes in a democratic society, there should be the foundation in place to allow for an electoral shift back toward democracy. And I would add a question to that, maybe. So what is it that we can do, those of us who are committed to democracy, to the community of democracies, on that people level that you, Laura, pointed out? What is it that we can do? Sorry, for some reason, your audio again is not great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Don't know why that happens. Okay, so what do we do to fix it, basically, which is the million-dollar question. We have definitely been on the back foot. And we have, as I mentioned at the offset, autocrats are not on the back foot. They are working together, they're sharing tactics, they're sharing ideas, they're funneling tons of money. You don't need to look further than Moldova or Georgia or the United States, particularly in terms of their information operations, and on the Eastern frontier in terms of financial contributions to parties or to, et cetera. They meet together. We're not doing that enough. So we're not sharing those best practices enough. And we're always playing defense. So instead of being, preemptive on the offense, getting ahead of things. And this, for example, let's just take one example: information space. Our approach to disinformation or misinformation, malinformation, or I would just say disorder, has been always reactive. Whack-a-mole, fact-checking, et cetera. I'm not saying fact-checking isn't important, but we are not getting out there with a preemptive message about why democracy matters, why multiculturalism matters, why this is part of our country's history, why, like when I was in Georgia, the country, Georgia, one of the first countries to have suffrage for women, oldest mosques and synagogues in Europe, multicultural and diversity and tolerance and all these ideas preemptively, rather than constantly being on the back foot. And I think that we've also failed in terms of our reach through media. So, we pale in comparison to Russia today. Russia today in the Spanish language is 10 times the viewership of Voice of America or any of our efforts through mainstream cable channels like BBC or CNN or whatnot. I mean, we just lose that battle every time. So I think part of this is really going on the offense and really digging deep at the local level. I think some of the most successful programs I did working in the democracy space overseas didn't happen necessarily at the national level, engaging with political parties or parliaments, which I trained for more than almost 3 decades. But really at the local level, engaging with civil society, independent media, and locally elected officials, and really working upwards. I'm not saying I had any breakthrough solutions here, but investing in civil society, independent media, civic education, and media literacy. I mean, I'm kind of want to see more results about the impact of that. But again, engaging locally. And in the United States, this is going to be really difficult. I think Europe has a better chance because we have a obsessive commitment to what we think we understand free speech to be, and we don't understand what that means. And we also have a allergic reaction, particularly this new administration does, to any form of regulation of bad information or the tech industry. So I think on that your side of the Atlantic, I think you're going to have a little bit more luck on trying to tamp down the bad stuff while enhancing the good stuff than we do on our side of the Atlantic. But there isn't one silver bullet to this. I think it's a long game. And I think that it was going to require a lot of investments, particularly for youth and at the local level and in schools and in education and in information.
Thank you. Maria?
To follow up on the regulation part, this was something I really like to highlight, how the European Union, the EU legislation can actually play a role. The digital agenda or control over digital media platforms has been a priority of the last commission. I believe it will be also high on the agenda of the new commission, and definitely fighting disinformation is one of the 7 security priorities of the Polish presidency of the council that has just started. And there is a good legal framework for it that was introduced by the EU to at least give member states a pathway to control the content shared on social media, especially very big platforms. I think France has already used it once against the owner of TikTok. But to be fair, it's all about political will and holding the platforms accountable for monetizing harmful, hateful content. And Brazil here sets a blueprint going after Elon Musk and X, formerly known as Twitter. So I think we won't fix everything through regulation. I could not stress enough the importance of citizen resilience that is achieved, of course, through education. But if you look at Sweden and Finland, they actually have this very broad understanding of security, total defense, which also includes citizens and citizen resilience to disinformation, telling fake news from true communication, from legit communication from the government, the authorities. So I think we should work more on this, and perhaps from the early age, so that the technologies are not 3 steps ahead of their consumers, because I have a feeling now with AI, with deep fakes, and also intended disinformation sharing, false content in the social media, we are losing this battle. There will always be people who follow conspiracy theories, but not all conspiracy theories have to be such that turn into political violence, as we saw not only in the US Capitol, but also in Reichstag in Germany, right? And again, in Brazil, the Brazilian capital. And last but not least, what we can do individually is, and that's my appeal to all our German guests, is go vote and don't skip the elections. February 23rd is the next option for us in Germany to vote. And I think this is the minimum that one can do to take this individual responsibility and keep politicians accountable. Looping back to the point I made in the previous round of questions, to make use of this make use of this very precious right that we have, and that we actually can make an impact and a difference. I know that Donald Trump has just won in elections. I know that populists or liberal leaders can win also in legit elections, but this does not take the individual commitment to do at least this minimum step to step up for democracy.
Victoria, can I add just a couple things that
Laura, we can't hear you well, but yes, please
protesting.
do step in.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Okay. How about now? Nope.
Still not great.
Never mind.
Whatever you did before worked really well. We do have a follow-up from Rachel. If I'm missing any hands, please do let me know, but I'm not seeing any right now. So I will read Rachel's follow-up and then, we'll then have Zeno come in. On Laura's point on civic education and media literacy, are we seeing the result of the gutting of the American educational system now? And I can tell you from my work, that's a question that we get quite frequently. Is this election result, is the election of Donald Trump also a result of sort of problems in the American education system? Rachel is saying a dumbing down of America as kids are just being taught to the tests because those are the valued metrics to show educational success, in quotation marks.
Can you hear me?
Kind of
Very
hard.
Quiet.
Oh,
but...
Try again.
Can you hear me now? No. I'm going to have to get off and get back on.
All right. Maria, do you have a take on that?
On the American education system, not really.
Okay. So,
but I can say that this could be very useful in any education system. The media literacy.
And let's put a pin in that and see sort of if Laura joins again, and we can have her answer that.
Laura just joined again.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if she makes it back to our breakout session.
While we wait, Zeno, did you want to come in with your question?
Yes, maybe because I imagine that long time the United States contributed a lot to building and strengthening up democracies in Europe, for example in West Germany, but also after the fall of the Iron Wall
Iron Curtain.
in Eastern Germany. I would like to know from you, Maria, and also Laura, how do you perceive it, if it maybe now changes a little, that maybe also the US could receive some knowledge or know how to strengthen democratic institutions and values in the US, and that maybe the value transfer can also get from Europe to the United States, or how do you perceive the reactions from US politicians or other actors? Is there something like this that maybe the United States can also learn from countries they helped building up their democracy, for example?
That's an excellent point, because the moment actually on November 5th or 6th, when all the election results came in, this has been a reflection in many of us in Europe that we can mutually learn. That's what you've said is all true. Then democracy promotion has been a important soft diplomacy, people-to-people diplomacy work delivered by the United States in Central Eastern Europe, in post-war Germany. But I think there could be knowledge transfer from societies that have been in the midst of autocratic episode. I'm thinking about Hungary in particular, the independent media in Hungary, the civil society in Hungary, academia in Hungary. Well, Hungary is and was home to Central European University that had to leave And this was George Soros, who is an American citizen, but now perhaps our colleagues there could share how they have been surviving this long time under Trump, under Orban. But I think there might be a different also experience. And here I'm thinking about the country I am in, which is Poland, that it has been a very jolly and happy story, a story of success that Europe needed in 2023. A country that goes, a society that goes against the current and votes out a national conservative government that was devastating the rule of law. But we saw that happening in 2020 in the United States, right? Trump has already been voted out once, but this is not a linear development. Autocratization and democratization are two-way streets. And we see that what happened in the US that many feared materialized. Trump is back. And I think this is perhaps a story to learn also from the United States, how to not fall back in the old tracks and how to prevent possible autocrats to come back to power. So you probably were expecting a little bit more upbeat and optimistic answer. I think the US civil society is bracing because they've already had that for 4 years, and the media and citizens with different interest groups. But what we can learn here in Europe is also how to avoid that illiberal politicians make a big comeback. And that's a lesson that we can learn in probably many countries.
Laura, should we try you again?
How about now?
Great.
Yay. I have no idea what's happening. So I'm sorry, I'm sad to have missed what just occurred. What I wanted to say.
I think that question is interesting for you as well, because Dina was basically asking democracy promotion, something that has long been done by the US.
Yeah.
Can now the US actually learn from Europe?
Well, I was in the democracy promotion biz at National Democratic Institute for 22 years. But the whole time I worked and I lived in Southeast Asia for 20 years. I lived in the former Soviet Union for 7. The whole time I never, ever approached that as America teaching others. I never had that opinion. For me, it was always about how can we learn from one another? What are best practices? This is always a two-way street. And in fact, I think, we don't want people to learn all the American examples, particularly when I was working in fragile or countries that just came out of dictatorship and were establishing their democracies. The last thing I wanted them to do was start crazy gerrymandering or creating these anti-majoritarian systems like the Senate or Electoral College or all these things. So I was never of that mindset. But I also, when I came back to the United States 3 years ago and I started working on American democracy issues, for the first time, we're a country of great hubris and pride. But for the first time, I actually saw a little bit of curiosity. And so, for example, I was in Maricopa County in Arizona, which was like ground zero in 2022 for election denialism and misinformation and disinformation. And I was meeting with election officials and they were like, we don't know what to do. There are armed men outside. We're getting death threats. We've never dealt with this before. And I was like, well, a lot of countries have. So maybe you can think about or listen to or learn from. And they had a lot of interest. And I was like, South Korea's election commission has an excellent model for preemptive information sharing and building trust in the election body. India has great experience with how to create risk assessment and planning for violence during the election. No one size fits all, but there was this interest. So I do think that there's opportunity here. I would like to also add that one of the things that astonishes me about my country is we're so innovative in so many ways. We are not innovative when it comes to our democracy. We are stuck in practices and institutional processes that have been in place and are not fit for purpose today. For example, a first past the post majoritarian system with two parties is the worst model for a deeply polarized society. Other countries, I think, have been way more innovative in thinking about different kinds of electoral system, ranked choice voting, deliberative democracies, citizens' assemblies. They're getting more creative. Rethinking representation. And this is where it's not unique to the United States, but I think so many countries in which I've worked, political parties are these gatekeepers to power, right? And they do not represent us. They are men. They are from the dominant ethnic and religious group, and they're wealthy. They do not represent their countries, but they're this barrier between people and power. And I think we also need to be thinking more creatively about what are other forms of representation. Not that political parties should be obliterated, et cetera, but what are other ways in which we can have citizens feel like they have more ownership over their democracy and have more say in their democracies. So that's all a very long-winded way of saying, heck yeah, we have a lot to learn. And always I've been writing and preaching and writing op-eds about the need for more of this information exchange. What's working? Okay, yeah, we know the Nordic countries have done this like great citizens resilience, and they have this even ministry devoted to, cross-sectoral, whole of society approach. What have you learned about that? Civic education, again, and media literacy. I'm not convinced yet. I want to see some data. What have we learned? Has media literacy really changed, moved the needle? I want to know, but we need to have more of those conversations. And that's when I say, Autocrats Inc., we need Democracy Inc. We need to be having those meetings and sharing those ideas. And it certainly needs to go both ways.
Thank you. We would have time to pick up that question from Rachel in the chat regarding the gutting of the American educational system and whether the sort of election result we're seeing could be a result of that. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, my kids are in the public education system, and I have some thoughts. I don't know if we can blame the U.S. education system for the dumbing down of our politics. But I do think there's been a dumbing down of our politics. In fact, there was a recent analysis of the debate, and we went from like a seventh grade level political debates, which is pretty sad, 10 years ago, to basically a third grade level today. We talk. If you go back even 15 years, I made my son do this with me. We actually wrote a joint op-ed together. He was 17 at the time. If you go back and just listen to a debate 15 years ago, 20 years ago, presidential debate, you will be shocked at how different it is from the way we talk today. It is like inconceivable that Americans today would have this policy nuance or these discussions. So I don't know if it's our education system, if it's just the fact that we have the attention span of a gnat, or if, reality TV has just pickled our brains. I have no idea what the actual problem is, but education system is the best place we can try to make improvements. And one thing I fear is that we're moving in the wrong direction. In this, what we've seen even in the last year in certain states, disregarding our separation of church and state, for example, in the state of Louisiana, where now it's like mandatory to have the 10 Commandments on the wall, and then all schools in Louisiana have to buy Bibles. And of course, the procurement for those Bibles was that it basically only the Trump Bible was the Bible that fit those procurement instructions, even though it was 10 times more expensive. So we've not only had like a corruption of that education system, but also like a clear violation of our secular nation. We are, even in my kids' public school, seeing, real blowback in our libraries, where books that I read in high school are not on the library shelves, or there's a big argument about what books we're reading. So yeah, and civic education, it really doesn't exist. My kids are not learning about our Constitution. They're not learning about how our Congress works. So I do think that is a place to start, but I can't say that, that this is the reason we have a dumbing down of our politics.
Understood. Thank you. We could keep this going, but we're at the point in time where we have to go back into the general session, I want to thank you both so much, Laura and Maria, for your insights. I thought it was a really interesting discussion, which I will now try to summarize within just a couple of minutes. Thank you also to everyone in the audience for joining us, for following along. And I guess, Zeno, correct me if I'm wrong, we will now sort of return. Will you have us return to the main session, or do we have to go there?
Yes, in about, I would say, 50 to 45 seconds, we will be called by force back to the main
see.
session, so we don't have to do anything.
Okay, we will be called back. Excellent. Well, that leaves us 30 seconds or so for any last thoughts, should you have them. Maria, Laura?
Thank you for the excellent moderation, Victoria.
Thank you. I appreciate your call to action and sort of telling us what we all can do to fix the problems you outlined. And now you can see that window popping up to return to the main session. I'll see you there. Thank you all.
I have to say it's been a while since we've done a Zoom meeting format. We often also do Zoom webinars, but it's nice to actually also be able to chat with people and have a more interactive experience. So for those who are open to it, please feel free to put your cameras on too. I think it's always nice for moderators and speakers to also be able to see who's in the room. Also understand if that's not possible at the moment, but we always welcome that. And I just got a note that there's still some people who are attempting to join, so we'll just get started in a minute or two here. All right, I think we can go ahead and launch into our conversation. I know other people will probably join in a bit, but we're really happy to have you all here with us to chat about the security topic, the security aspect of all of this specifically. And as we already said, it obviously has a lot of overlap. We also want to hear from you, what, in your kind of professional experiences, what, are the main topics that you're thinking about, concerned about. And then we'll kind of come back together at the end to hear from the other sessions as well. So today, I think, our main goal is really thinking about what are the expected priorities of the Trump administration, what will the impact be for Europe, where is there opportunity for cooperation, what kind of scenarios might we be able to imagine? And Rachel and Ian, I'm really happy to have both of you here. I think, you obviously work for the same organization, or at least are coming from the same organization, but coming from different perspectives, which I think is really helpful. I want to remind everyone too who's continuing to join us, please feel free to write into the chat, but you can also use your little virtual hand at the bottom if you want to join the conversation and ask a question yourself, and I'll do my best to put those in the correct order and make sure we get to everything as quickly as possible. But maybe I can start us off with a question at the beginning, and I guess thinking about not just the inauguration, there are going to be other people who are part of this administration. We've already seen, the hearings for Hegseth. So I'd be curious to hear from you, and maybe Ian, you can start us off this time. Rubio, Hegseth, Michael Waltz for National Security Advisor. What do these appointments indicate about the administration's strategy moving ahead?
Thanks, Katya. I mean, I guess, it's interesting. We're now 10:38 here, Washington time. So I'm not watching TV. I'm focusing on you. But probably right now, Trump and Biden are heading over to Capitol Hill. And Trump is going to be taking the oath of office, not out on the outdoor podium, but actually in the Capitol Hill chamber that his own rioters 4 years ago ransacked. Mm-hmm. And then when he's going to unleash a set of executive orders, it's going to probably pardon a number of those rioters. So that's a little bit of the tone that it underscores, permeates this transition. And as I noted before, he comes back to the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, the White House, as President 47, more emboldened, more experienced, more determined, and maybe a little bit more resentful toward the establishment and its political opposition here. That could also apply to a certain degree to his outlook on the world, and particularly Europe, and particularly the European Union and some of the key European states who are seen as kind of the international establishment. We know he's going to act with dispatch because there's going to be some 200 or so executive orders he's going to sign in that rotunda and at his what do you call it? His meeting at the Verizon Center, his rallies, so to speak. So when you look at that, I see an administration is very focused on domestic agenda first and foremost, but there'll be international dimensions. And for Europe, I think we're going to have it's going to be a turbulent 100 days. And let me just, what I see in the first 100 days, well, there are going to be immigration actions. That's domestic, but they could be kind of hard-edged, and that could leave a lot of Europeans very uncomfortable. It's going to be all about, unleashing America's oil potential. He emphasized that last night. This is drill, baby, drill. And he's going to expect Europeans to buy American energy. One of his executive orders, in addition to the energy executive orders and the immigration executive orders, is to pull us out of the climate change agreement, the Paris Accords. It's going to leave Europeans a little bit uneasy. On the Middle East, he's going to swing behind Netanyahu in a way Biden never did. He's going to probably pull away from the two-state solution, or at least dilute our commitment to that. And I bet you he's going to gear up and hammer Iran with some serious sanctions, all of which is going to leave Europeans probably a little bit uncomfortable. As Rachel noted, he's probably not coming in to hammer NATO. He kind of feels a little bit of credit for the quote-unquote success it was made over the last couple of years. But he himself has already called for 5%. I don't know if that's an opening bid or that's actually the hard number that they want. But I got to say, as a security, one who focuses on security policy, that's not an unreasonable number in light of the world that we face today and the way we've spent in far less complex and challenging worlds and events and challenges in the past. You asked about Hegseth. Look, pivot to Asia. This is going to be more real than before. Obama tried it, and he actually did it. He pulled every U.S. tank out of Europe. And then realities with Russia's invasions of Ukraine pulled us back. Both Hegseth, and Rubio at their hearings really emphasized, China's the pacing threat. That's got to be the focus. And these other contingencies, like the invasion of Ukraine, are distracting to that challenge. We'll see what that actually manifests. What happens to Ukraine, I think, will significantly affect that. And then on Ukraine, the defining issue when it comes down to the transatlantic relationship, and probably for Trump's national security policy, we'll have to see what happens. We know what he has said in the past, and it's a concession to Putin. Well, now he's in office. There's some signs that he's reconsidering his position. We'll have to see where that goes. But that will be the biggest indicator of, what he will bring to the transatlantic agenda, what his commitment to the transatlantic community will be, and what will be the future of Europe. And in closing, let me just say, the ball is not just in Trump's court, it's also in Europe's court. And now is the time for Europe to stand up and shape its perspectives on this. And the most important thing that they can do to get Trump to do the right thing on Ukraine is to stand up and saying, we're ready to put a deterrent force into Ukraine. It will be we want it to be 80 to 90% European, but we need a dose of American leadership. That's not a guarantee he'll do the right thing, but I can't think of anything more effective to get him to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And I know, already it's been mentioned I think you mentioned that, Rachel, at the beginning about, the prioritizers. Ian, you just mentioned pivot to Asia. So really this idea that, the faction that wants to focus on China and neglect Europe a little bit more is likely to be the one that wins out between these different Republican camps. I guess, am I understanding that correctly, Rachel? Is that your take as well? And then I guess too, I do think it's interesting, and I read a bit about this Mad Men theory in the last weeks that Trump throws out the 5% goal, or he talks about seizing Greenland and Panama or annexing Canada as these kind of wide-reaching goals that give him arguably more negotiating power. So I'd be interested too, how does that play in? Do you think, is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can look back at his first term and the madman theory. I do think there's something to be said about that, because usually the way that things work with Trump is that he comes to the table with just sort of this insane opening bid, which means that anything other than that actually sounds like a pretty good deal to the people on the other side of the negotiating table. And that's kind of how he likes to do things. And so that's how I've looked at his conversation about Greenland, this idea that he wants to buy it, this idea that he can't rule out using military power or economic coercion in order to achieve that goal. To be clear, I don't think either of those things are going to happen in the Greenland sense or the Canada sense, but I do think, going back to what his priorities are, his domestic agenda is going to come first. In the next day or so, we're going to see massive immigration raids in places like Chicago. The Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, is already planning for this. And so, to the extent that his foreign policy is a focus of his administration, it's going to lay on the shoulders of the experts that he has hired to forward his agenda, whereas he, and I think his really close advisors, his inner circle, are going to be much more focused on what is happening domestically. The international dimension, I think, is likely going to be focused on China. And this is where the conversation about prioritizers comes in. This is people like Bridge Colby, for example, who, as everyone knows, probably in this room, who is well read in foreign policy, has been someone who has written about the pivot to Asia for years now, and how the U.S. commitment to Europe is a distraction against that broader goal. And so, looking at people like Hegseth, looking at people like Bridge, like Mike Waltz, like Marco Rubio, and to see all of these different threads of foreign policy, economics, trade, hard security, military, kind of come together in this broader economic competition with China. I think this is going to leave Europe in kind of a tough spot, because Europe hasn't quite figured this out yet. I know Ian has written a lot and spoken a lot about the need for Europe to project more power in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think Trump is going to expect that in a way, although I don't know that Europe's ability to do that would take away from the fact that it is economically intertwined with China. This is a tough one for Germany as well. And I think that's going to be a main part of the conversation for Trump and his team. He said he wants to visit Xi Jinping early on in his administration, which I could see happening. He's going to save TikTok today. So all things to keep an eye on. I want to go to one thing that Ian said that I think is totally right. Trump is no longer seen as an aberration. He is now seen as a mainstay of US politics. And even if this is Trump's last turn at the wheel, I think Trumpism is where the Republican Party is now. And because his ideology, it has spread, and now it's sort of more acceptable to play a part in that, the pool of people he has to pick from has actually broadened over the last 4, 5, or 6 years. So there are people now, if they didn't come out the first time around as never Trumpers, who would now be more willing, I think, to go into a Trump administration, which means that I think this term, although he's kind of a madman, you never know really what's going to come out of his mouth. Like, the ability for his team to shape his policy objectives might actually be much more effective. And that's both a good and bad thing. But his ideology has also spread to Europe. I mean, you have this with the Elon Musk, Alice Weidel conversation. You have it in Marine Le Pen. You have it in, different right-wing figures throughout Europe. And so this is why I focus a lot on conversations about community of values, because those values used to be so set, and now there is, I think, kind of a breaking apart of them, and two sides of the coin here, where you have this sort of technological oligarchic crossover with far right politicians, and then people who are trying to hold on to these like democratic norms and values, and these are now clashing up against each other.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I Right. That's obviously something that needs to be reassessed moving into it. I guess I'm curious, do you think what should be the European approach? I mean, I think we've also seen not just in Europe, but different approaches already with, Canada, maybe in reaction to kind of some of the statements made recently, maybe reaching out to the source, Mexico pushing back a little more harshly. So there's been also different approaches from world leaders broadly on how to deal with them. And I'd be curious, what do you think is the best approach? I know that there was, this recommendation from the EU on kind of negotiating options. Is that the right approach? Is transactional the way to go? Ian, maybe you'd like to jump in, or Rachel, please.
No, Ian, go ahead. I was going to say
I just
Ian.
saw you unmute yourself.
For me, I think Rachel's right. I'm not quite sure it's a madman approach. I think it's a little bit of, I want to be a tough guy. I want to be seen as powerful. I want to do something historic, as opposed to madman. But Rachel and I can debate that, and we're still in the same position, regardless who wins the debate. The key for Europe is to keep the eye on the ball and not get distracted by some of these statements, these assertions, which I do believe are somewhat intentionally provocative, distracting, discombobulating. And if Europe allows itself to get into a tizzy over those things, it won't be doing anything good for the transatlantic community. It won't be doing anything good for itself. It's got to focus on, what are its core interests and how those core interests relate to transatlantic unity. That's the simple way I would take to approaching Trump. Europe's got to have an agenda. Europe's got to demonstrate it's willing to exercise its power in support of the transatlantic community. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of truth in Trump's criticisms of Europe. It's shared by many Democrats too, by the way, that Europe really hasn't stood up. Now, in the security realm, that's clear. You look at defense spending. And unfortunately, the good news is that, they've increased their defense spending. What is it? 22 or 23 of NATO allies now spend 2% or more. All of them together, it's over 2%. But we're in a world where 2% isn't enough. I'm not even sure if 4% is enough. And so that's why I'm falling into the 5% camp. When you talk about dealing with challenges, not just in Europe, but globally, the big challenge before the transatlantic community today is preventing three contingencies: high-intensity warfare in Europe, expanding conflict in the Middle East, and increasing Chinese provocation and aggression in the Indo-Pacific from metastasizing into something that could be a global catastrophe. And that's going to require resources. That's going to require Europe standing up. And by standing up and putting its assets on the table, that's how you shape and reshape, so to speak, Trump's perception of the transatlantic relationship and the value he places on NATO.
Thanks. Rachel, did you want to add to that?
I think that the difficult part of the transatlantic security conversation, probably since the end of the Cold War, is we've been in sort of a rhetorical spiral where the United States has said that Europe needs to do more. It has to take on more of the responsibility for its own security, but then sort of pushes back when Europe tries to do that. And then I think there's also this worry amongst Europeans that more autonomy, more independence will actually result in a less committed United States. And I don't think that's the case, especially for the next 4 years. I think what Europe can do and what Europe should do is demonstrate that it can project power in a meaningful way, which I think Europe struggles with, but also protect its neighborhood and protect its continent. And this is where I think conversations about deeper EU-NATO cooperation come in. And I think, Ian, you were part of this group that wrote this new transatlantic charter for 2025. That kind of talks about this, like the importance of really deep coordination between the EU and NATO so that the European pillar of NATO can grow and support the foundation of this alliance and remain, and as a result, the United States will remain a committed partner and remain the foundation of European defense. And I think, Europe building up its own defense industrial base is going to be important. I think the EU empowering the new defense commissioner is going to be extremely important, because I see this person as potentially a bridge between the United States, the EU, and NATO. And I don't think there's any way that we can easily overcome, bilateral security issues that have plagued cooperation for a long time. But I do think that having a point person at the EU to play this role could potentially help. But I do think that in terms of what the Trump team is going to expect for Europe, it is going to come down to numbers and spending and a more efficient defense industrial base and deeper conversations about what the United States provides, what it will continue to provide, and maybe what Europe needs to start thinking about doing on its own.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess that's my question too, is, I mean, how can the US make that an easier transition? These are going to be huge, huge transformations for European countries. European citizens are going to feel that. And I think European leaders also need to get their citizens on board politically also with, out facing more populist pushback based on economic issues and everything else that countries like Germany and France are currently facing. So what can the US do, I guess, to ease that for European partners? Is that their job?
Katja, if I could just, I think this, all due respect, I don't think that's the right approach, asking what the United States should do. If Europe comes to the United States and saying, Mr. Trump, you're wrong in your approach and your criticism of NATO, you've got to do this, you may just call it a day. That's going to tick him off, and it's going to reinforce his sense that all the Europeans do is basically ask the United States to carry their burden. Mm-hmm. This is a moment for, not autonomy as a form of leadership. It's a time for Europe to stand up as a NATO ally, as a NATO partner, as quote unquote an equal of the United States, sitting at the table of North Atlantic Alliance and saying, hey, we need to do this, and towards this end, we, Europe, are going to do this. And in the case of Ukraine, and which is the most urgent issue when it comes down to preventing a global escalation of conflict, is challenges ending this war on just terms, on terms that ensure maximum military stability. Europe needs to stand up and saying, hey, we got the message. This is in our backyard. We're willing to bear the heaviest burden of what needs to be done to secure Ukraine. And we are willing to put this deterrent force in place. We have the forces. We're ready to go. We need America to help lead us and orchestrate this, to ensure that it has maximum deterrent capability. We think your contribution can be limited, some C2, some aircraft, basically what you already have in Europe, and we will go forward. Trump could find that appealing because he wants to be associated with winners, not losers. And if he sees the Europeans not willing to stand up to do what needs to be done, and sees Ukraine being something going into irreversible loss or defeat, he's going to walk away. So this really is in many ways not a time for what Europe should be asking America to do, but what Europe should be standing up and doing to pull the United States in the right direction.
Just to add on to that, I completely agree with Ian. I mean, I can't say how many times that we've been in conversations with Europeans who say, we need a set of expectations from the United States. And that's just the wrong approach for the Trump team. I also think that I've heard over the last, couple of years, obviously, Europeans say over and over and over again that the war in Ukraine is existential for them. And the more Europeans say that, and I think that that's probably true in many senses of the word, but the more Europeans say that, I think the more Trump is going to say, okay, well, this is existential for you, then step up to the plate and figure out how you're going to provide long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. And this is, I think Moritz has a chat here. It's kind of long, so I'll come back to it in a second. But I think that's that's the approach that is going to be taken over the next few years, is that this is existential for Europe, and therefore Europe needs to come up with a plan, and it's going to be a tough sell, I think, to the public in many countries.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm seeing Moritz, I think, is mostly agreeing with both of you.
Yeah, I mean, look, this debate about NATO countries not paying enough, it goes all the way back to Eisenhower. There's a quote that I read that said, Eisenhower worried about the Europeans making a sucker out of Uncle Sam. And even debates after World War II about, European presence on the European continent. I mean, these debates have been going on for 75 years. And so I think Moritz is totally right. This is not something that started with Trump. Remember, Obama famously had said he hated free riders in his Atlantic interview from all the way back in 2010, 2011. So this debate has been going on for decades.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining the conversation, Moritz. Also, please feel free, others who are here, to join. Send questions via chat or raise your hand. We'd love to also make sure we cover as much as possible that is of interest for you specifically. I think maybe, we've talked a bit about Ukraine and ongoing conflicts. I would be curious to hear from you all the Russian invasion, Gaza, Israel, those were all conflicts that arose under Biden's administration that, were not something that they envisioned for their time in office. What would you, without asking you to predict, specific events, but what do you think are going to be kind of the biggest security issues to dominate in the next 4 years? Are there emerging threats we're not thinking about maybe as top of mind at the moment? Rachel or Ian, I'll give you a moment to think, but please feel free to jump in. Ian, please.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute. The screen is tough. Look, I'll throw that out, and then I got a question for you all, since if others aren't going to throw a question. The big security issues, we are facing the most complex and most volatile and lethal international security environment when it comes down to the interests and values of the transatlantic relationship. And it's not just Europe, it's now global. So my list is, as I mentioned, 3: Russia, China, information challenges. But we've got an unstable Africa. That's going to have ramifications for the United States, particularly in terms of the critical resources over there. We've got AI. We've got biowarfare. And then I would add, and it's probably the focus of the other working group, but we're facing a profound rollback of the kind of international free trade order as protectionism kind of has a growing tidal wave effect on all of our policies and those of our allies and partners beyond the transatlantic realm. So those are that's on the menu, so to speak, of your National Security Director for Europe and Eurasia and your Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia here in Washington. The question I wanted to throw out to this group is, again, a little bit focused on Ukraine, is, Macron has been stimulating some interesting discussions on some sort of military presence in Ukraine. I think he's framing it as part of the peace settlement rather than as part of the win strategy for Ukraine. He's been talking to the UK about it. He's been talking to the Poles about it. Do you see this as getting traction?
I'll leave that in the room for a moment to see if anyone would like to jump in. Maybe Rachel, if you'd want to respond to that yourself or to the question for me, and then we can have people join in a sec.
Katya, you should jump in on that one.
I would love to hear from the audience as well. But I'm not seeing many takers.
Yeah. And your question was just basically on Macron, basically?
Macron has been discussing some concepts of some sort of peacekeeping, peace monitoring force in Ukraine. I don't know if it's the magnitude of a deterrent force. But I'm wondering, he's talked to the Poles about it. He's talked to the UK about it just last week. I'm just wondering, does this have traction in Europe, or are people just brushing it off?
Yeah, it seems like, there were a few of us that were in Poland, in December. And it seemed like the idea of any sort of like physical presence was a no-go, at least until mid next year. And so I think that that's it, Macron, I think, like has a habit of laying things out there and not necessarily pushing the needle, but like sort of frustrating people into a certain position. And I wonder if that could be what happens here, where having France come out and kind of plant the flag here pushes other people along. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from the Europeans too, because we hear about these things in Washington, but it's hard to know what the actual mood is like on the ground for folks over there.
Yeah. I haven't heard much traction, but in terms of it being kind of a part of debates thus far, but I think exactly what you just mentioned, Rachel, throwing it out into the room is the first step. And then I could likely see that the Germans at this point are also a little preoccupied with their own political situation and the elections coming up. But Evelyn, I saw that you unmuted yourself. Maybe you'd like to come in.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, thank you all of you for all the contribution. It's super interesting. I think that really what you just said, Katja, is pretty much the problem, that we're in the middle of an election campaign. And so most of the decision makers kind of don't come out too much like on a possible presence of European troops in Ukraine. I mean, the foreign minister had briefly mentioned something like this, but talking about CDU, CSU, and Friedrich Merz as a presidential, as a candidate for chancellor, he is more working towards like this contact group on Ukraine with Great Britain, with France, with Poland, where they want to reach a common solution. But right now, it's pretty difficult in the campaign to hear some very clear statements about where things are supposed to go, because also the Europeans kind of want to wait what is really going to happen. And then it's still the talk about that it's about Ukraine to define what is going to be a just solution or an agreement. And I think only afterwards they're really going to talk tachlis about what they're ready to do and what not.
Yes, and also I think Abby, also speaking to the internal German political conversation, thinking about security issues and challenges there with the differing opinions of the AfD and the BSW coalitions, which has also, I think utilizing anti-American sentiments also for domestic political gain is another kind of element to the conversation. Moritz, I'd love to have you join.
Sure, thanks for having me. Maybe just briefly on that point, because I actually had another one. My feeling is that it is a bit more complicated than that, and that it's also, once again, a bit due to our history and specifically also strong Russian ties in certain circles of our political establishment. I mean, if we look at our Russian policy in the past decades, on both sides of the spectrum, partly CDU, but also SPD, of course, with Steinmeier, etc., quite influential. And generally, on a bigger level, I think for whatever reason, people also to some extent don't want to accept the reality that, again, there is actually a looming conflict and that things are not getting better. And I just find it really bizarre. I mean, I went to quite a few security conferences here in Europe, also Berlin and in Prague, and you speak to people, and everyone is really worried what might happen in 4 or 5 years. And depending on whom you ask, people are rather certain that certain things will happen. It's rather the question of when and where. And in Germany, it's really not at all a topic, also not in the election campaign. And so my view rather is it's again a bit also a bit of a mix of denial, then still love for the old Russian ties and the very strong cultural German-Russian relations over centuries. I mean, half of also of the imperial family, many of them were German by origin. And it's an interesting mix, and it's a big disconnect depending on whom you speak to. And Germany is somewhat isolated in terms of debate. But I was already too long, but I actually wanted to make another point. I would be very curious to know a topic we haven't really talked about, which is hardware and software security. Now, the Biden administration made some very last minute moves last week when it comes to, again, China and limiting access to II chips, etc. And then you also read up on new technologies and people in the US security circles being scared of a Black Swan event, maybe in 3-4 years, that China might manage to actually hack even using quantum chips or secure communications. So I would be very curious to hear what our US experts' view is on where we will be at the end of Trump 2.0 when it comes to hardware and software security towards China and the EU. Because my feeling is that we are actually on the way towards, again, a world which is rather bipolar, so that we will have a sort of Western and allies software and hardware system. And then on the other side, there will be China, Russia, North Korea, as proxies. Thank you.
Would one of you like to start with that question?
I'll jump in real quick. I don't know about the hardware software, so I'll happily share that with Rachel. On the Ukraine thing, I think a couple of points. One, Trump moves fast. He moves with dispatch. He's got the attention span of a small goldfish. He moves. That's good and that's bad, because it's better than the indecision you often got with Democratic administrations, Obama and their processes, and Biden to a certain degree. He moves fast. Two, he's sending Kellogg to Ukraine right after. I don't know. It's going to be probably next week, maybe, or around that time. But that's going to be pivotal. He's going to go into Ukraine. He's going to do his assessments and come back. Expect Trump to act on that. Third point, Trump is actually showing a certain amount of open-mindedness to new approaches. You all know what he said about Ukraine. NATO membership is what caused the war. He doesn't like giving assistance. This is a European problem, not a U.S. Don't want rah. But in the last 2 weeks, he's gone from solving this in 1 day to 100 days. He's described. He said he's not going to abandon Ukraine. He's described Russia as an adversary. Now, I'm not saying this is a sea change, but these are slivers against that background at a time when he's taking new responsibility and looking at the situation. But he moves quickly. He's going to make a decision quickly on what he wants to do on Ukraine. And if Europe doesn't stand up and try and profoundly shape this outcome, you're going to get one of two outcomes. He's going to impose on Europe and Ukraine a solution that's going to be very rewarding to Putin, and it's going to be a recipe for long-term instability, if not an expansion of the war in Europe. Or two, he's going to walk away, which is basically the same outcome. So Europe needs to stand up and stand up now.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add on what Ian said. And Moritz, I wish that I could answer your question on hardware, software, but I don't know enough about it to offer a response that is any more than what you already laid out. But I agree with what you're saying. And it's probably something that we all need to watch much more closely. And your question certainly shows that that's probably something that all of us should be doing. You're muted, Katya.
Thank you. We're going to be kicked out of our breakout room in about 2 or 3 minutes. So maybe I can end with a question, just looking ahead to the Munich Security Conference, which I know, many are looking at as kind of also a scene setter, get more insights on what the U.S. Position is going to look like in the next few years. I'd be curious to hear from you what you expect out of that. Specifics, maybe you have intel on who will actually be joining from the US side, but also, broad topics and what the general feeling will be.
Yeah, I'm not sure who Trump is going to send. I mean, it was interesting because Biden had sent Kamala over the last couple of years, I think, to bolster her foreign policy credentials a little bit. And she gave speeches, and I wasn't in the audience, so I'm not sure how those speeches were received. But I do think it's an opportunity for, if Trump wants to show leadership on Ukraine, on Europe, he'll go himself. It's going to be interesting to see the congressional delegation that ends up going. This used to be led by John McCain, of course, so it used to be a very, very important delegation that would go. So let's watch that closely, and let's see who from the Trump team offers, big speeches and bilaterals over that couple of days. I think it's the second weekend in February, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know, maybe Ian would have more information.
Yeah. Ian, you're muted as well.
My apologies. I want an award for always muting myself. Look, Trump's first major engagement internationally is actually going to occur today, and I'm not talking about the inauguration, which of course that's going to be an important message, and it'll be interesting to see how much time he places on international affairs and whether or not he addresses the transatlantic relationship. But he's going to address Davos, I understand. So that's going to be kind of a major foray. I'm skeptical that he would show up to the Munich Security Forum. It's not his forte. It's a rough environment for him. A lot of establishment Europeans there and such. It will be interesting to see whether or not he sends J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio or Hegseth. If he sends J.D. Vance, I think that'd be a very positive thing. Even though it could be a confrontational exchange, it would show he cares. With Hegseth or Rubio, it'll be more not so much in their presence, but what they say, because that's what usually shows up, so to speak, from the U.S. side. If none of them show up, boy, that would be a powerful indicator itself. But I bet at a minimum, someone from the cabinet level will be there. Maybe J.D. Vance. Message, I'm willing to bet, is going to be a hyperbolic super emphasis on 5% and the need for the Europeans to continue to stand up and carry their share of the burden. That, I think, is going to be the major theme.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting, beyond the speeches that are made, the main messages in those, also just the general feeling. I think people who are there kind of walk out with an idea of what the mood is. Certainly after Ukraine, that was the case, but also last year. So it'll be interesting to hear from
But if I could just add, it's also an opportunity for the Europeans to express what they're willing to do and demonstrate their leadership within the transatlantic community.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so very much, Rachel and Ian, for giving us lots of good food for thought. I have a list of notes because I am a big note taker. I don't remember anything, so I have to always write it down. But thank you again so much for those insights, and we'll all head back to the main room. I know that they're also just wrapping up. To do that, you can actually just click. We're not going to be called back apparently, so we'll just click on the room, leave room at the bottom right. Mine says Raum verlassen. Or we are getting called back, apparently. See you back there.
Katja said, we are going to stay in the main room for our trade discussion. And I'm really sorry that I had to jump off. And I was so glad that Katja could briefly hop in. This is what spring or winter is about, getting those colds and those coughs. But I'm very happy to be back and to be able to moderate the session with also Molly Hall, who's with us from the Aspen Institute, who might again jump in if I get one of those coughing fits. So please bear with me, and that shouldn't hopefully hurt our discussion at all. So thank you so much to those of you who stayed in this discussion room. I think we have a lot to talk about, and we already heard many issues on our transatlantic agenda, which we should take a closer look at, both on the trade side, but also on the tech side. And maybe we can also dig a little bit deeper into energy issues, climate issues, or in the realm of economic cooperation. And before I open it up for the broader discussion with all of you, our participants, I would like to come back to Peter and Joshua to give you the floor to tell us a little bit more about the risks you identified for the transatlantic relationship, but maybe you also see some opportunities, and maybe you also want to bring in something positive, or maybe not. So Joshua, you identified in the introductory discussion tariffs, economic impact, but also the technology space. Maybe you want to tell us a little bit more about these issues.
Sure. I think this all obviously gets prefaced with the comment that we don't quite know what all this will ultimately look like. On tariffs, for instance, there's realistically a range of, at the upper bound, it's 20% tariffs on all imports from Europe. I think that's probably a less than likely scenario, and I think somewhere between that and where we are currently is a range of tariffs, possibly at the lower end of the 10 to 20% range on a more targeted range of imports that maybe get phased in over the time. So I think that within that tariffs are coming. I think it's really just a question of when and how broad they are going to be and at what rate. And then I think there's ultimately this question of how Europe responds to that. The opportunities sort of the way I would sort of try to think a little bit about the potential opportunity space is that at the end of the day, we all know that Trump is very transactional, and there is always, I think, within that space for a deal, right, a bargain of some sort. So I think that there's a question of whether that is actually achievable, whether that, I think the best case scenario at some level probably, which is sort of trying to shift to thinking about this a little bit from the opportunity side, is that the European Commission essentially manages to put together a package that is sufficiently attractive to the Trump administration that convinces them to, say, forestall or delay major tariffs, leads to cooperation around a couple of key areas, maybe leads to Europe slowing down or sort of backing off a little on some of the technology tariffs, not technology tariffs, I shouldn't actually say that, but whether it's a digital services tax or some of the investigations underway, but they can still, they would still continue. I know that's a rule of law issue, and it's not necessarily easy to politicize that piece, but there may be some scope there. We see more alignment, say, for instance, on China. We see greater defense spending and maybe a promise to buy a certain amount of energy and other agricultural products. You can imagine something coming together that might be attractive to a Trump administration. I think the flip side to some of that is that there's a view, I think, in the Trump administration that they don't, that Europe is going to have to move on a bunch of these issues in any event, particularly with respect to China. I think China is sort of this one space where it seems obvious that cooperation with Europe is, pretty critical in some respects when you think about what the United States really wants to do to be competitive and sort of succeed in its broader competition with China, obviously around technology, ASML, but other areas of export controls. There's been some conversations around, moving to inbound investment screening, tariffs on China, which I know are controversial within Europe. But I think there's this view that if the US does in fact go ahead and put significantly higher tariffs on imports from China, Europe's going to be sort of compelled to raise tariffs on China's imports just to avoid all the diversion that's going to happen to the European market. And so, I think it's an open question to what extent that the Trump administration sees a deal with Europe as kind of necessary to achieve some of the goals some of the direction it wants Europe to move into in any event. I think on the climate and trade piece, it's probably so the GASA discussions, which obviously broke down under the Trump administration, will clearly not be revived under a Trump administration. I think the one thing that's going to happen in this space is that there's been interest in Congress for a while now imposing a border and carbon adjustment, notwithstanding there will not be a domestic carbon price in the US. And I think this will get traction under a Republican Congress part in an important way as kind of a way to respond to imports from China as well, but it'll also be used against Europe. But it does, so it's going to present, I think, this I think is going to be complicated because the issues that Gasser broke down with obviously remain, and the difficulties that Europe has in identifying sort of climate action in the US that is not a carbon price that may though add up to something meaningful will remain. And then there is the added uncertainty of what actually domestic action will look like in the US under a Trump and the future of the IRA in particular. So this is an area which is uncertain, I would say, to say the least, but I think we will see sort of climate as some sort of tool that the US may more likely employ at the border. And I think then given the implementation of the carbon price in Europe and domestic carbon border tax in Europe, how that intersects with the US, I think runs another risk of that being another source of tension in the transatlantic relationship. But I think again, this will be possibly one area where there might be an opportunity to work together to try to kind of work around that, but that remains to be seen. So let me stop there. That's enough for me at this stage.
Thank you so much. Before I hand over to Peter, I just wanted to ask you, Joshua, when you said there will be tariffs to also achieve the Trump administration's goals. Could you just say what, in your view, those goals are? Are they just trade related, or maybe also other topical areas?
So it depends on what bit of the elephant you're touching at some level, who you're talking to. I think for Trump, it's traditionally been a combination of trade deficits are a sign of a losing trade relationship. His words, not mine. And obviously, the trade deficit with Europe has grown, and so I think broadly speaking, that animates his view towards trade relations with Europe and will be a basis for him for putting in tariffs. If you look at I think the political campaign of the Trump administration generally has really focused on a sense of grievance and losing out, and trade has sort of been cast as being quite central to that. So I think that also animates the approach to putting on tariffs as well. There are, there's a view, of course, that's evolved as well that tariffs will be a tool to pay for tax cuts and other spending initiatives. And so how that, there's going to be, I think, a big fight over that in Congress, over how that works and how that gets scored ultimately in any type of tax package that does go through Congress. There's a real tension to that, because if you see how some of the best center others have sort of testified before Congress, they've sort of said tariffs are going to be both a negotiating tool and a revenue raising tool, and you sort of can't do both, right? Because negotiating suggests you put them up, but you take them down at some point, right? So the long-term viability of that as a funding tool, I think, remains to be questioned. And I think a lot of people think that it's not really a viable funding tool because of essentially elasticities and declining trade that happens at some level of tariffs, so that your revenue streams drop off quite considerably at some point. And there were other economic costs associated with it. But we'll see. I mean, this is going to be an ongoing argument.
Thank you so much. And now over to Peter. We heard from Joshua that it's pretty likely that we will see tariffs. So, Peter, what would you say? How popular is Trump's trade policy at home, and how likely will it be that there will be tariffs against Canada and Mexico on day one, with the EU maybe following, not on day two, but pretty soon after?
Well, I think that a lot of Trump's voters opted for him because they thought he would do a better job at taming inflation, whereas it's almost certain that if he puts on tariffs across the board, that those are going to be inflationary. It's also going to make it harder to bring down the value of the dollar, which he wants to do to reduce the U.S. trade surplus. So if there begins to be some disenchantment with the effects of what voters thought they were going to get, I think that'll be interesting politically. In terms of when he's going to put on tariffs, it's hard for me to say what's going to happen with Canada and Mexico. I mean, there is the USMCA, which at least kind of, in a legal sense, makes it a little more difficult because there could be lawsuits and all that. There is no U.S. EU trade agreement that would pose that kind of obstacle. But let me just echo something that Joshua said. I wrote a piece last week where I looked at some of the opportunities, and when you talk about U.S.-EU tariffs, there is the expiration of the Biden-engineered truce on Trump's Section 232 national security tariffs on the EU on steel and aluminum. So that'll expire at the end of March. I agree that there is not going to be a resurrection of the global arrangement for steel and aluminum type of negotiations we had under Biden, but something has, either there, at the end of March, Trump could put those tariffs back on, then the EU could decide to retaliate or not, or something else. And I think that it's true that it's going to be early in his administration for this kind of initiative, but given the activity from Senator Cassidy and others on the Republican side in the Congress on using trade policy to push back against what is frankly China's overproduction that is generated in part by its climate unfriendly mode of production. I do think there is an opportunity, particularly if the people in the Congress push and if the right members of the cabinet push for something that I call a climate security club, which would not be like the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is purely driven by climate concerns. But frankly, I think that whether it were under Donald Trump or under Kamala Harris or under the next president before the end of this decade, I think that the U.S. and the EU are going to have to face a choice between free trade and protecting the climate. And frankly, again, the EU has violated WTO rules occasionally in the past. And I think there's a lot worse ways to violate WTO rules than for the climate. It may not be attractive to do it under an administration on the U.S. side that's not as like-minded as maybe a Democratic administration would be. But if you do want to try to find opportunities for cooperation, then I would second what Joshua said, that the intersection of trade and climate, perhaps somewhat ironically, does offer that.
So there are a lot of studies which look at the costs of tariffs, both for the United States, but also for the EU. And some go as deeply as saying something about the costs for Germany. So when all those calculations are done, without taking into consideration EU countermeasures, some analysts are saying that the costs aren't going to be so high, and we shouldn't get so worried about it. And the EU, given that the costs are not so high, should be very careful in using countervailing or retaliatory measures. So, Peter, you're nodding. Is that an analysis which you share? Or would you say the EU also needs to show strength and say, hey, what's right is right and what's not right is not right?
I think it depends in part on the level of tariffs. The most recent thing there are many options that seem to be out there, but one of them is, for example, across the board tariffs, but only in certain sectors. So those would include tariffs on Europe. Now, it depends also on not just the composition of them, but the level of tariffs. If there are tariffs of 10%, which is one of the things Trump mentioned during the campaign, my guess is the currency markets will adjust, the dollar will go up, the euro may go down, others will go down. And, a 10% tariff may not be as painful as some fear. But, when you start getting much above that, then I think it gets into a little more uncharted territory. I think the point, though, that's most important is that Trump is threatening to put again, it's a bit of a moving target, but it seems still to be out there that he would put even bigger tariffs on China. And then there is that issue of that Joshua mentioned of trade diversion. And so I think I think that for the EU, yes, there's the issue of direct tariffs on them, but I think there is also this issue of perhaps even larger tariffs on China, and what is the EU going to do about that? Now, I'm cautiously optimistic if you look at the fact that not too long ago, the EU decided to impose tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles that have been unfairly subsidized, there is a precedent for the EU taking, reasonably tough action on China. We saw some division within the EU on that, but I think the issue of US-EU alignment on China, again, no matter who the president would be, that would have needed to move in an even more kind of united direction. And so I think some of Trump's policies will have the effect of driving that, kind of intensifying or speeding that up.
Joshua, to build on this question I just posed to Peter, what would you recommend the EU to do? Should it also proactively look for areas where it could do some deal making and offer, for example, the buying of LNG or looking for defense products, or what would you recommend the EU to do?
Yeah, first I want to agree with a lot of what Peter said. I think particularly if you do get tariffs at the lower end, the reaction of the currency market will be critical here. This essentially is largely what happened with China tariffs, and so I think there is a cogent argument to be made that if you look at this from a macro perspective, this may not be all that problematic, and that actually this retaliation might be avoided. Of course, there's a domestic political economy of particular sectors, and that's a separate thing. It's interesting, this purchasing offer. I think that it obviously flies in the face of sort of free transactions and how market economies tend to work. But this is obviously sort of what was central to the deal with China, which didn't quite work out. We came out quite strongly against that deal with China for a number of reasons, but one was that it essentially made all these sectors of the United States beholden to these purchasing arrangements, right? Like if they weren't sort of being driven by sort of quote unquote market forces, but sort of propped up by whatever government policies that China was going to enact to make that happen, then you had farmers and others essentially relying on that as a kind of basis for their exports. And that's something you don't want the US to be in a position with China. But if you're thinking about this from a European perspective, essentially, further integrating the US and European economies across energy and defense seems actually like a good policy for Europe for two reasons. One is that Europe actually does need to buy more energy and defense products from the United States anyway, given the challenges in Europe on those topics. And it essentially creates, frankly, constituencies in the US that are even more invested in that relationship with Europe, which I think politically is a good thing for Europe. So I think that is possibly quite a good way forward for Europe. I want to say finally on the China piece, I think it's a sort of a three-dimensional kind of chess game at the moment, in part because there are two other factors out there which I think are going to be important for Europe. One is whether the US actually pursues another deal with China. And if they do, I can imagine there's going to be a completely different set of incentives for Europe to do something similar with respect to China. But then the other part of that is the state of the Chinese economy. I mean, if they are getting particularly hit by US tariffs, the Chinese economy is a lot more vulnerable than it was in 2018 when tariffs first came into effect. Then China may also be in a different position with respect to its willingness to do a deal with Europe. So there's a bunch of factors out there which, depending I think on where the US ends up with China, may see Europe in a more confrontational position vis-a-vis China, or actually doing a deal with China as well.
Thank you very much. I would love to bring in the participants, our audience. And I saw that we also have representatives from the chemical sector. We have representatives from the financial sector. And we also have some analysts and researchers with us. So this is my invitation to you to just raise your hand. Should be done electronically. I don't see any yet. And you can come in with questions, but certainly also with comments, because we want to learn from each other. And I still don't see any coming up. So I do have another question to our two speakers. We talked now about the bilateral issues and also the triangular issue of EU, US, and China. And what I get from both of you is that triangle, or that the China piece is going to be a very important piece also for the transatlantic relationship. And I would also move a little bit to the issue of the rules for the global economy and how we play this game. So from the first Trump administration, we know that things have become a lot more transactional, and that the administration is not such a great fan of a rules-based multilateral trading system, not such a great fan of the WTO, but also not a great fan of other organizations like the OECD and so on. Joshua, does this mean that the end of our global trading system as we know it and the end of the WTO?
So I don't think the Biden administration, despite a slightly different tone and posture, was all that more friendly towards the WTO either. So I think this is a sort of a long-term secular trend, so to speak, in US policies with respect to the WTO, unfortunately. And the question I think that the question the Biden administration was very much asking is what comes next? How do we build international economic cooperation, which is not dependent on traditional FTAs, which is less focused on the WTO? And you saw experiments in that space with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, with the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. These are sort of works in progress. I don't think anyone thinks they are answers or responses to that. But that's kind of an ongoing, I think, project in the US. I'm not sure what that will look like under Trump. I don't think there will be kind of a vision for doing a kind of a deeper form of economic cooperation amongst partners, amongst allies. I think it will be quite transactional. But I think that question will not go away. And so it's something that, and it will not be answered quickly either. So I think it should be a conversation and a kind of a beginning that Europe really should be a key player in, right? So I think for Europe, part of the question is, how do you rebuild an economic system that brings the US back in a meaningful way? And that should be seen as kind of a medium, long-term thing that Europe engages the US within, even if it's not going to be that productive under a Trump administration. So the other piece is that one of the things I think that Washington, loses sight of very quickly is how the rest of the world remains fairly committed to a rules-based order, the WTO, and to doing actually FTAs, right? So, and this is where I think the big hole in the US approach to sort of international trade policy clearly is the fact that the rest of the world is sort of marching ahead, and the US is not, and is so. I think this is where, honestly, I think the European Commission really should be leaning into support for trade agreements, the WTO where it can, building coalitions with other like-minded countries outside of the United States, with Canada, with Australia, with Japan, with Singapore. There's a long list, I think, of countries who are sort of on board broadly with that agenda, as a way of sustaining the rules-based system around trade for the ongoing future. So I think these things operate in parallel. It's very hard to predict the future, whether the US comes back to something like that, or that you have to rebuild something again in the future. But I do think a lot of what's being built retains legitimacy amongst a lot of countries, and I think Europe should sort of continue to push that.
Peter, do you agree?
Only partly. First of all, I think as a still hegemonic power, even if a declining hegemonic power, I think it's normal that the United States is sort of is a kind of one-man avant-garde in trade policy. In other words, it was pursuing free trade agreements and helping to build the WTO when that was seen as the way to advance its interests. And now the fact that it's focusing more on security or resilience or climate, I think that's also normal. The other thing I would say is that no institution is built to last forever. And not only that, but when you look at the creation of the World Trade, or the GATT, which is the predecessor to the WTO after World War II, I think it started out with 23 or 24 countries, right? And so I think that some of that spirit that we had after World War II, a kind of practical coalition of the willing plurilateral approach, might be useful now. Not that we should do anything to harm the WTO before we know what else we could come up with. But I think that in parallel to the WTO, it might not come out of the Trump administration unless, as I think both of us may have been suggesting to different degrees, there could be something on climate and trade. in the longer term, I think it's normal that the U.S. will rebalance its efforts and look for new ways to create rules and order and norms in the global economy. And I think that's a bit what Biden was doing. We'll see whether Trump does any of that. I'd be skeptical, not impossible, but I think whoever comes after Trump will probably continue to do that. So when we say that the WTO is declining, I would yes, I don't think that has to be entirely a negative thing, depending what else is going on.
Thank you so much. And with this, I would like to invite Hubertus Barth to come into the discussion. And the team is going to free your mic so that you can.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Thanks, Stormy. Thanks for that wonderful conversation. My question is regarding energy. The American share of Europe's LNG imports is about 50%, and it's almost 90% of Germany's LNG imports, which is not too much, but still comes from the US. So, and my question is there a risk that the new administration uses that new dependency as there's not too much short-term alternatives on the market as a lever for any kind of trade or other political endeavors?
Peter, Joshua, who would like to answer?
I can jump in. I think that that's not impossible, Hubertus, what you're suggesting. And I think it's precisely for that kind of eventuality that the EU started towards the end of the first Trump term, to build some new tools in foreign economic policy, the first of which was at least one of the first was the anti-coercion instrument. There's a procurement instrument. There are some new anti-subsidies regulations. Looks like they're going to work more intensively on foreign investment screening. So I think that the question is how much deterrent effect those new trade tools that the EU is developing could have in a situation like the one you're describing. Ideally, they're used as a deterrent rather than, and frankly, it's more likely I think they'd be used against China. But I think that ideally they're used as a deterrent. But unfortunately, if it gets to that degree, then they would have those tools available to actually implement. So I see the risk you're pointing to. I feel better about it if I'm sitting in Brussels. I feel better about that because of the work that's been done during the previous von der Leyen Commission.
I just want to add a couple of things to that. One is that if you look at my sense is that one of the things to look for is, I think, actually what happens with Canada on energy trade. I think there's an expectation, I think, that energy trade with Canada will probably be exempt from tariffs. About 60% of US crude oil imports come from Canada. Tariffs would be inflationary. It would hit businesses. It would hit consumers, and so forth. And I think, generally speaking, this is what happened. Energy was untouched largely during the Trump administration with Canada, and I think there's a view that the Trump administration and Trump himself is really keen to expand US exports of energy. Now, that is not to say that it couldn't be a point of leverage at some point. So I think clearly a European strategy is to try to have relatively diverse sources. LNG is hard because they're often under long-term contracts, but there is kind of an evolving spot market. But I think that is a risk, but I see it as sort of a slightly lower risk at the moment than for other areas that might be tariffed by Trump administration.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hubertus, you know that I always love to turn it around as well. I know that you also work on energy issues and that you are an expert on transatlantic relations. What would your take on the issue of energy be?
Yeah, I'm really thinking about that, and I'm not sure. I think the risk is not too high. I think there is natural gas consumption will remain high. That it's necessary for Europe to commit to some long-term investments in on long-term contracts, which is and which they didn't so far, which is the reason why so much is coming from the US. So again, here diversification I think would be one of the answers, but that wouldn't change it fundamentally. So I hope that we're not running from one bottleneck into the next.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, the diversification after Russia's invasion of Ukraine leads us to some new dependencies, which might also be hard to handle in the future. Thank you so much, Hubertus, for joining in the discussion. I would now like to invite Jan von Herf into the discussion as well, and your mic should be freed in a second.
Okay. Yeah, now it's working. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect.
Hi, Tony. Great to see you, and all the best that you get well soon. And thanks for the two panelists for sharing all the insights. Now, what I was wondering a bit is like on the trade and security nexus, and how likely you'd see the US exploiting this further. I mean, we saw the first actions now from the Biden administration with export restrictions on the KI chips, where the EU was not treated as a single entity, and of course this will cause havoc and to the internal market. And how do you see this thing playing out? And can we expect more actions like this, maybe under the pretext of security, even though it's not ideological and in deal making? But I'd be interested on your take on this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jan. Who would like to start first this time? Joshua?
Sure. So I think that for a couple of reasons, the national security framing will remain and probably be broader under a Trump administration for a couple of reasons. One is the domestic authority that the Trump administration will rely on for tariffs will require sort of categorizing the threats as national security. So I think we'll see that continue. But I think also more broadly, you saw under the Biden administration, I think a real effort. It was a hard one. It was sort of like the boy plugging his finger into continuing emerging holes in the dike. But you had this like small yard high fence concept, right, where there was a real attempt to put some boundaries around kind of what was national security and what kind of needed to be protected, and then sort of what could remain outside and continue to flow. And that was kind of an expanding space naturally, but it was an attempt to keep it somewhat bounded. I think that the Trump administration didn't really do that in the first term, and I think they will see national security more broadly than the Biden administration. So they will have a much, I think, broader concept of sort of where economic security. They will tend to, I think, define sort of economic security and national security terms broadly. So kind of from their perspective, I would imagine a lot of industry that they think needs to be protected will be kind of seen through a national security lens, or will be given that justification. I think it'll be a much expanding field, and so I think that will make it challenging. But I think that was what we should expect.
I agree with what Joshua said, and it makes me think of a little bit on the opportunity side, and the call not too long ago by Friedrich Merz, the CDU chancellor candidate during the campaign, the general election campaign, for a kind of, I'd call it TTIP 2.0. I don't think that free trade agreement between the United States and the EU, structured the way TTIP was, has any chance of coming back. But again, if we look at the first Trump term, when there was a kind of deal that Trump and then President of the Commission Juncker put together, and we look at the fact that Trump is sort of on the one hand an ideologist when it comes to things like the trade deficit, but also someone who likes to do deals. If there's going to be a US-EU trade deal, there's no question it's going to have to be an economic security deal. I don't exclude that there could be some market opening involved, but I think it would have to be, a deal to line up the US and the EU on common standards towards and rules towards China. And that, I think, is a challenge to the EU because while it's moving in that in the direction of putting together trade and security. It hasn't, there's an EU economic security strategy that's been in existence for, I think, a year or two now. That is something harder for the EU to do, because while the EU has trade competence, it doesn't have competence in defense and foreign policy the way a unitary state like the United States has. That is, I think, a long-term challenge for the EU, whoever the president of the United States is. And I agree with Joshua that, under Trump, this economic security framing is just going to get even more intense.
Thank you so much. And with this, I would also like to bring in Laurent Weisenberger. Laurent, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very interesting discussion. While talking about TTIP or free trade agreements, I wanted to ask what your perspective is, because, well, there, especially in Germany and Europe, there's a lot of hidden champions. So smaller enterprises, smaller businesses that are really good in the special field that they serve, but not like the big enterprises, like the automobile industry. So what would tariffs on the long run mean for those? Would we have like a further disentanglement of the US and European economy, so that maybe later a free trade agreement would be less rewarding for everyone? Or would businesses in the United States and Europe rather try to pull through and hope for a post-Trump era?
Peter,
yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that one. I think what you mentioned, it's correct what you're saying. I think what you mentioned is a kind of microcosm of a bigger problem, because a lot of those companies provide inputs that American manufacturers use for their final assembly. And of course, there are a lot of domestic firms that also provide those. And so I think one of the big questions about the Trump administration is, does it really have the ambition to replace every single manufacturer of every single input with a U.S. company, or is it going to realize now or later that that is mission impossible? I will say about the Mittelstand companies that you refer to, it's interesting to see how they have more than the big companies in Germany, to use your word, disentangled from China. Now, of course, there's only so much disentangling you can do. I mean, China and the United States are both big markets. Where do you disentangle to if those two are not available to you? So I can understand their predicament. But I think that kind of flexibility that they're already showing is very positive and will be helpful whatever happens.
Joshua?
Yeah, I think it gets back a little bit to the original question around the economic costs and what the tariff levels are and how the exchange rate adjusts. I think the kind of immediate economic impacts may be less than kind of feared. I mean, it needs to be remembered, right? Like, so Europe's got a 10% tariff on automobile imports, and there's still a lot of like transatlantic trade. So a lot of trade will continue. I mean, I think there's a lot of ballast. There's a huge amount of ballast in the transatlantic trade and investment relationship, and so that will not disappear, and it will grow actually. Based if there's U.S. economic growth, and if Europe could grow its economy more strongly, I mean that trade relationship will grow. Certainly, in the face of a 10% tariff with exceptions, and potentially even a 20% tariff on certain exports with exceptions, would not be automatically devastating. I think, it's the other side to your point about trade agreements is that when you do have tariffs, it makes actually a trade agreement quite valuable to do somewhat down the front. So it creates, this is the Trump vision of leverage, right? Like the year of tariffs on average are very low. With some peaks. Europe is similarly quite low with some peaks. But when you have higher tariffs between really the two most important trading relationships out there in the aggregate, then there's going to be an incentive at some point to work through that, I think. So we'll see.
And unfortunately, we are almost at the end of our breakout session, but I want to end, Peter and Joshua, with one question. There's so many big champions and small champions, German champions, which are producing on the US market and are also very important employers to US workers. And they have strived in the last years. What would you recommend them with the changing political environment, what to do within their states, but also with regard to Washington? Joshua.
Look, it's actually kind of a hard question to answer. I mean, I think I actually wouldn't. I would try not to get too distracted at some level by what's going to be happening at the federal level in the US. It's obviously a very big market in the United States, and I think the opportunities to grow opportunities economically are going to remain, I think, irrespective and of what goes on. I think the hardest thing for smaller, medium-sized businesses generally is regulatory uncertainty. This is something larger companies can navigate and with a little bit more ease. And so I think that's partly the challenge. So I'd be sort of focusing more on that piece as well. And the final piece is, to the extent, what do you do domestically? I'm not suggesting companies go out and lobby, but I think that a restrained kind of approach in terms of retaliation would probably initially might be in Europe's best interest. I mean, we'll see where the US ends up, but I think given other macro forces, it may ultimately not be as bad as we're thinking initially, and retaliation may be unnecessary, but we'll see.
Peter, also a last word for you from you before everybody comes back into our main room.
Okay, two things. First, whether it's the companies themselves or others, I should make sure the White House understands that the flip side of the German trade surplus with the United States is all that foreign investment in the United States you're talking about, and I would make sure that the White House understands that foreign companies export more than US-owned companies and pay higher wages. But I would also use it as an incentive inside Germany to think about the German economic model, which is overly export dependent. You saw that with China. Now you're seeing the risk with the United States. I think it's not just a German problem; it's also a European problem. All the more reason for this new European Commission to take the Draghi report to heart. But it also means that the next German government is going to have to be willing to make some changes in terms of the stimulation of domestic investment, but also make some changes in terms of their policies towards the EU to allow things to be done at that level, which will help all of Europe to become more resilient to the kinds of external shocks we've seen from China and may see from the United States.
Thank you so much. We exploited a little bit having the main room by going a little bit over time. So thank you so much to our two panelists in the breakout session on trade, but certainly also to all the other speakers in the other breakout rooms. Maybe we can also now be joined by our two wonderful moderators, Victoria and Katja. And maybe we can pin them. There's Katja. And Katja, thank you so much for stepping in earlier when I have that coughing fit, and I'm very happy to be back. But I listened in diligently and took away a lot from the first discussion. And there I saw Victoria for a second, and there she is. So the last 10 minutes we wanted to spend with summarizing what we heard in our breakout sessions. Oh, and I would also invite Molly Hall to be pinned, because she did, or she is going to report from my breakout session. So Victoria, how about the transatlantic values, partnership and community? Do we still have one?
Good question. Thank you, Stormy. I will try to summarize very briefly the discussion that we had, and we actually started with that very question. And our speakers, Laura Thornton and Maria Skóra, agree that the transatlantic relationship is many different levels, and it depends on what level you look at, how you answer that question. So yes, the government level within the transatlantic partnership is very important, obviously, and on that level, values may take a back seat or will likely take a back seat during the Trump administration, but the transatlantic partnership also exists on a people-to-people level, where those values may continue to play a bigger role. We did look at the pressures, the challenges that democracy is facing both in the US and Europe. And our speakers pointed out that those pressures exist on both sides of the Atlantic and not only in the US. And we outlined sort of some of those pressure points from institutions failing to deliver, the feeling among people that government is not working for them, all the way to corruption, and the effect of a global economy on the working class. But also, we talked about the deep social value cleavages and those cultural cleavages that put pressure on democracy. And one sort of additional element that had popped up already in the first general session, that issue of disinformation. And the fragmentation of the information space that sort of goes hand in hand with the polarization of society we're seeing also on both sides of the Atlantic. Then we also talked about how to fix it. And while I can't give a full summary, maybe just a couple of highlights, we heard from both our speakers that as Democrats, as people who are committed to democracy, we need to do more. We need to connect better, exchange best practices. We need to form those same bonds and connections that the autocrats of the world have already formed and are in the process of strengthening right now. And we have to get on the offense in communicating why democracy and the values that connect with it are important. I highlighted sort of one statement: we need Democracy Inc. We need that coalition of actors committed to democracy to come together even more closely. I hope, Laura and Maria, this adequately summarizes the discussion we had. Otherwise, please do jump in.
Perfect. Victoria, you got thumbs up and a little bit of applause. Seems to have been a really interesting discussion. And luckily, we have recorded, if I'm not incorrect, and then we can listen. All of us who joined other breakout sessions can listen up later on. And with this, I would like to hand over to Katja for the exciting topic of security.
Yes, we had a good conversation, lots of different points, food for thought. I think the first, some of what maybe a first overarching point is basically that, Europe is not going to be the core focus. First of all, Trump will be focusing on his domestic agenda first and foremost. He, enters his second term with a different outlook. In general, he kind of sees himself versus the international establishment. There's a pivot to China. We talked a bit about some of the appointments that he's made that really echo this prioritizer faction of the Republican Party, where you can't kind of be all over the world, but it's also not a complete isolationist approach. Our speakers made a great point that, Ukraine is kind of the defining issue for the transatlantic relationship moving forward, but also, generally that we should not, Trumpism is also the Republican Party at this point. So that's Europeans should be aware of that moving forward in the next 4 years, but also beyond. We also spent quite a bit of time, I would say maybe even the majority, talking about Europe's approach to the next 4 years of Trump. And our speakers emphasized that an active EU is essential, so needing to take responsibility for their own security. I think Ian mentioned, Trump will move quickly on his decisions. He's which can also be a benefit. He's not going to dwell maybe long-term on decisions, but rather act quickly. And even thinking about Ukraine, that will be a quick decision. EU needs to be on board. They need to be able to also motivate and kind of be able to make decisions as quickly as him. he wants to be associated with the winners. So we did, you know, I think that the term in the room, the madman theory, which there was a little disagreement about that, but thinking about, you know, these ideas he's thrown into the room on Greenland and Canada and Panama and other ideas. At the end of the day, he wants to be associated with winners. And so that will also kind of color the Ukraine approach. Maybe two just final last points. Rachel, you know, mentioned at one point that I think, you know, she mentioned that Europe sometimes perhaps worries about that a more autonomous Europe will lead to a less disinterested United States. And from a Washington perspective, that's, you know, not the case. That EU needs to really keep the eye on the ball, thinking about what its core interests are, what it's going to do, you know, how it's going to continue to promote transatlantic unity with this new scenario. So hopefully that does a little bit of justice to our conversation, obviously not covering everything, but I'll also invite you to jump in if you think I've missed any really essential points or to emphasize anything.
Ian, Rachel, happy with Katja's summary?
Hi. Oh, I see Ian is muted, but I think he's speaking.
I just added what I tried to, it's not time for Europe to sit back and wait for Trump and what he'll do. Europe needs to stand up and shape Trump's perception. When it comes down to Ukraine, it means standing up primarily and saying what it is ready to do to bring an end to this war and stability, military stability back to Europe. And for me, that's putting on the table what could be a viable deterrent force. And Europe needs to do that fast.
Well, Ian, we are not so known for being so fast in the EU. When Katja said that, you talked about Trump is going to move quickly and the EU needs to react quickly. I thought, ooh, well, what the decision making we have and the 27 member states and consensus requirements and at least some foreign policy areas, that might be something hard to do. But it is something to practice, I would say. And now last but not least, we also hear from our last rapporteur, Molly Hall. You're going to be pinned while I'm going to be unpinned.
Yes, exactly. I had the pleasure to join Stormy in the session on trade with Peter and Joshua, and I think Katja, we can piggyback a little bit on your group, kind of this need for the EU to take a little bit more action. I think that was a little bit discussed in our group, but really we talked a lot about the tariffs. What should we actually be expecting? Do we really think that there's going to be these very high tariffs, and ultimately what are the real costs of them? And so, there it was discussed that, yeah, we can expect a 10% tariff, maybe up to 20%. But at the 10% level, that the currencies will probably equal it out, and that it might not be quite as painful as everyone is predicting. That being said, in terms of opportunities, because this was obviously the tariffs are one of the biggest challenges in terms of opportunities for trade under Trump 2.0, it's really the fact that remembering that Trump is very transactional. And so the EU has a chance here to kind of take advantage of that and to come up with a plan, a strategy. This is where I kind of mean it's the EU's turn to kind of take a bit of a role. And Peter came up with mentioned the really good idea that there could be a bit of like a climate security agreement, that in that space there's a little bit more room for collaboration. One thing that both Peter and Joshua agreed would probably not come up again is going to be the global arrangement on steel and aluminum. But that since the tariff agreements that Biden came to with the EU expire at the end of March, that's definitely going to be something that we have to keep an eye out for. And that right now it's a little bit too soon to tell what might actually happen with that. We talked a little bit about what the EU should do, and this is again kind of maybe further integrate the EU and US energy and defense sectors, a little bit more on the climate opportunities that are presenting themselves, and that really there is a role for the EU to play here, and they don't need to just kind of sit back and have a bit more of a reactionary stance to the decisions that the US is making. We also talked a little bit about kind of like what does Trump mean for the future of the global economy? Is it the end of the World Trade Organization, the WTO? Long story short, no. But that there is kind of room to reevaluate the type of agreements that are made. Trump is not as into the free trade agreements, but pluralism presents an opportunity for us to kind of come together. Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
2 more points. There's a couple, there's a little bit of discussion on trade and security and this nexus, and there was agreement that this is very much going to continue under Trump and probably be even broader, and that there's still opportunity for the business community in the U.S. to especially the German and the EU business community in the US to kind of have some wins and inroads while they're over there. With that, I will.
Well, Molly, thank you so much. It shows what a rich discussion we had. It's only we are at the end of our meeting today, and it's only another 30 minutes before the official inauguration ceremonies start. So I want to end with a very fast round, really a very fast round, asking you, what do you think is the word which is going to be most mentioned by Trump during the inauguration ceremonies? Rachel, do you want to start?
America.
Oh, America. Ian.
America followed by vindication.
Thank you. Joshua.
Yeah, America and probably tariffs.
Peter.
Awesome.
Awesome. Okay. Laura.
A sweeping mandate.
That's a good one too. Maria.
Well, I'd say democracy has to win.
Thank you. And Katja?
Oh, I wasn't prepared. I was just listening to everyone else. Freedom.
Freedom. Victoria?
Well, in his speech, if that's what you were asking about, I
Yeah.
think America first. And then I read something about common sense coming up, so I'll listen about that.
Common sense. And Molly, last but not least?
I'm going to say China.
China. All right. So we are going to do a word count in 45 minutes to see who of you was right. My bet would be on America as well, America first. We'll see. Thank you so much for joining us. That was a very rich discussion. Katja, I'm handing over to Katja, who's going to tell us a little bit about the road to election and to wrap it up.
Yes, this was actually our last event in the Road to Election series. We've been doing this for over a year now, from January last year to inauguration. And we've had, as Stormy mentioned at the beginning, 37 events. We worked with 35 partner organizations, transatlantic organizations on both sides of the Atlantic who've organized their own events. We had over 3,500 participants throughout the year, showing how much interest there is. So it's been really so productive and fun to get to work with all of these partners. And I think it really shows how strong the transatlantic partnership is from a organizational perspective, and how many people really are there to make sure that it stays strong in the next 4, 8, 12, 50, 100 years. So thank you all again so much for being here for our final event.
And I think this is what matters. As Victoria also said, from your discussion group, it's the people who matter. And all of our 35 organizations stand for the people and the interconnections. And that is something we promise to uphold. And I'm very sure that all the 34 other partners are going to do the same. So please join us for our next events, even if it's not under the Road to Election series, but join us to keep on being or doing what we can, and that is keeping the people-to-people connections strong. So thanks so much for joining us, and then enjoy the ceremonies.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye bye.